The Lehman Brothers trading floor at 3 in the morning is a cathedral of silence, though not the kind you might expect. Somewhere in that vast expanse of mahogany and chrome and dark glass that sprawls across 46 stories of a midtown Manhattan tower, the air is moving very slowly. The ventilation systems that have hummed for decades at a frequency just below human perception continue their work now in the absence of voices. No phones ringing, no shouted orders, no rush of currency and attention that characterized the daylight hours. The floor itself stretches out in darkness, broken only by the faint constellation of computer monitors that no one has bothered to switch off. They glow with a pale amber luminescence, like embers in a blackened hearth, their screens casting long shadows across the trading desks, where hundreds of men and women have sat for thousands of hours, watching numbers flicker and pulse with the rhythm of invisible markets. If you were to stand there in that darkness and let your eyes adjust, you might notice something almost meditative about it. The dust motes, and there are always dust motes in places where so many people have worked and stressed and breathed, catch the monitor light as they drift through the still air. They move so slowly, these tiny particles, suspended in the darkness like slow thoughts moving through a mind that is finally resting. The keyboards are silent, the phones are dark, the Bloomberg terminals, those portals to real-time information that have defined Wall Street for 3 decades, sit dormant. And yet somehow, even in this quietness, the space holds a kind of weight. These desks, these chairs, these screens, they are part of a story that spans more than 160 years. They have witnessed booms and crashes, fortunes made and lost, the rise and fall of men who believed themselves invincible. It is a strange thing to imagine a place of such frenetic energy, such constant motion and urgency, in complete repose. But there is something important about beginning here, in this darkness, because to understand how something falls, we must first understand what it was while it stood. And Lehman Brothers, in the years before the morning that would change everything, was one of the most powerful, most envied, most feared institutions on Wall Street. Its name carried weight, its decisions moved markets, its ambitions seemed boundless. But like all stories, and this is fundamentally a story about the rise and fall of a single name across generations, it began somewhere else entirely. It began not in these towers of glass and steel, not in the corridors of power on Wall Street, but in a much smaller place, a place of cotton and commerce, a place where 4 men had an idea about building something that might last forever. If you've ever wondered what happens to a financial institution when it chooses ambition over caution, when it mistakes size for strength, when it forgets the very lessons that kept it alive through depressions and wars, if you've been curious about the quiet mechanisms of trust that hold banking systems together, and what occurs in the moments when that trust is shattered, I'd love to have you subscribe to follow this slow, careful descent into one of history's most consequential financial catastrophes. This documentary unfolds the true story of how a family business that survived for over a century, that weathered the Great Depression and 2 world wars, came to an end not in a moment of obvious recklessness, but in a slow, imperceptible accumulation of choices. We'll move backward through time, and then forward again, and we'll do it gently, so you can drift along with the narrative as it settles and deepens. Now, to understand where Lehman Brothers was when it fell, we must travel back to where it began. The year was 1844. In Bavaria, a region in what is now southern Germany, a young man named Henry Lehman made a decision that would ripple across generations and continents. He was perhaps in his 20s. The precise details are lost to time, as many small, consequential details are, and like so many young men of that era, he sensed possibility in the world beyond the place where he had been born. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe. But for a Jewish merchant in Bavaria, the opportunities were constrained. The laws were limiting. The future, while not entirely closed, felt confined. So Henry Lehman did what thousands of others did in that period. He gathered what he could carry, and he sailed toward America. What must that journey have been like? The Atlantic crossing in the 1840s was not the journey it had been even 50 years earlier. Steamships had begun to make the voyage more predictable, less likely to result in death from disease or starvation. But it was still a voyage, still weeks at sea, still the smell of the hold, still the constant proximity to strangers in conditions that were, at best, cramped and uncomfortable. Henry Lehman would have spent those weeks watching the horizon, thinking about what he was leaving and what he hoped to find. He was leaving behind a world where his choices were limited by circumstance of birth. He was moving toward a world that promised, at least in theory, that a man with ambition and intelligence might build something of his own. He landed in New York, as most immigrants did, but he did not stay. Instead, he made his way south, down to Montgomery, Alabama. Why Montgomery? The historical record is quiet on this point, but we might reasonably imagine that Henry Lehman had either family connections there or simply sensed an opportunity. Montgomery in the 1840s was a growing city, a place of commerce, and commerce of a particular kind. Alabama was cotton country, and cotton was the lifeblood of American commerce in that era. So Henry Lehman opened a store, a dry goods store, a general merchant's establishment where people might come to purchase the goods they needed: fabric, tools, supplies, the thousand small items that constitute daily life. It was a modest beginning. It was not a bank, not a financial institution, not anything that might suggest the enormous corporation that would eventually bear his name. It was simply a store, a place where goods were bought and sold, where money changed hands, where a young immigrant could hope to establish himself. But here is something worth reflecting upon. That modest store in Montgomery, Alabama, was the seed. Everything that followed, the rise through the 19th century, the climb to Wall Street prominence, the accumulation of power and influence and wealth, all of it grew from that small decision to open a store and offer goods to the people around him. The fall, nearly a century and a half later, would eventually trace itself back to the same source: the need to grow, to expand, to reach for more. Henry Lehman was not alone in this venture for long. His brother Mayer arrived from Bavaria, also seeking opportunity, also drawn to the commercial possibilities of America, and soon after, another brother, Emmanuel, joined them. 3 brothers, working together in the cotton country, watching the great staple of the Southern economy flow through their hands. The name on the storefront would eventually become Lehman Brothers, though that transformation happened gradually, without fanfare, as these things often do. At first it was Henry Lehman, then it was H. Lehman and Company. Then, as the family enterprise grew and more hands contributed to it, it became simply Lehman Brothers, a name that suggested stability, family, continuity, a name that would come to mean something entirely different across the span of generations. The dust in that darkened trading floor, drifting slowly through the amber light of dormant screens. Those motes contain, in a way, the memory of all those years. They are the accumulated past, settling, waiting. And as we move backward through time, as we follow the Lehman family story from its modest Alabama origins through its transformation into a colossus of American finance, we are essentially watching that dust rise up again into the light, becoming visible, becoming part of the story that must be told. The cotton trade in Alabama would prove to be the foundation upon which everything else was built. But cotton itself was not their final destination. That was only the beginning. If you've ever wondered how a single institution, built by hand, sustained through wars and crashes, surviving on reputation alone, could grow so large that its collapse would ripple across the entire world, then you're beginning to understand the question at the heart of this story. The House of Lehman was not born into dominance. It was built, brick by brick, choice by choice, over more than a century and a half, and like all things built over such a long span, it carried within it the fingerprints of every generation that touched it. What makes this history so quietly compelling is that it is not a story of sudden greed or single mistakes. It is, rather, a slow accumulation of decisions, some wise, some blind, made by men who believed they understood the game because they had played it longer than anyone else. There is something profoundly human about that kind of confidence, and something equally human about the moment when confidence transforms into something darker. This is the kind of history that unfolds best when you have time, when you can linger on the details, when you can follow not just the facts, but the emotional and moral texture of how an institution thinks, breathes, and eventually breaks. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, histories of rise and fall told slowly enough that you can feel the weight of time itself, then I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel. We explore these long, intricate narratives about how the world of money and power actually works, told in a way that lets you understand without needing to rush. Stories that move at the pace of thought itself, rather than the pace of headlines. Now, let us travel back, not to the gleaming towers of Manhattan in the 21st century, but much further, back to a moment of emigration, back to the beginning, when three young men left behind everything they knew to build something new in a country they'd never seen. It is the year 1844, and somewhere in the kingdom of Bavaria, in the gentle rolling farmland of southern Germany, a family named Lehman is preparing to leave everything they have ever known. We might imagine them, on a cool autumn evening, gathering what few possessions they could carry, perhaps looking one last time at the modest home and the narrow streets where their lives had unfolded. The reasons for departure: economic pressure, religious restrictions on Jewish families in Bavaria at that time, or perhaps simply the call of possibility that echoed across the Atlantic, would have been practical and urgent. What matters, as we move backward through this vast financial architecture toward its roots, is that on some unremarkable day, Henry Lehman and his brothers decided to cross the ocean. The voyage itself took weeks. Imagine the crowded hold of a ship, the sway of the Atlantic, the uncertainty of what awaited on the other side. These were not men of particular fortune or education in any formal sense. They were traders by nature, pragmatists, people accustomed to recognizing what others might want and finding a way to provide it. When they arrived in America, Henry first, it is believed, sometime in the early 1840s, they carried with them not capital, but something that might have been more valuable: an instinct for commerce and a willingness to begin again in a place where birth and family history mattered less than ambition and reliability. Henry Lehman found his way to Montgomery, Alabama. Why Montgomery? The question hangs gently in the air. It was a growing town, a place where cotton, that white gold of the American South, was being traded and transported. It was a frontier of sorts, and in frontier towns, there is always room for someone willing to work. Around 1844 or 1845, Henry Lehman opened a small dry goods store. Do you see it? A modest storefront, perhaps not far from the river. Inside, shelves stocked with fabric, thread, tools, household items, the ordinary necessities of daily life. This was not finance. This was not yet even commerce in the grander sense. This was simply keeping shop, knowing your customers by name, understanding what they needed before they asked. The American South of the 1840s was itself a world in transition, though of course, those living in it did not fully understand the tremendous fracture that was approaching. Montgomery was a town of ambition and agriculture, of plantation owners and merchants, of the steady, wealthy hum of an economy built on cotton. For a young immigrant merchant, it offered possibility, and Henry Lehman, it seems, was a man who recognized possibility when he saw it. When his brothers Mayer and Emmanuel eventually joined him, Mayer arriving sometime in the late 1840s Emmanuel following after, they did not disrupt the quiet rhythm of the store. Instead, they became part of it. The brothers seemed to have possessed a particular gift. They could see beyond the immediate transaction. They understood that a customer who bought fabric today might need something else tomorrow, and that trust, once earned, could be the foundation of something larger. Slowly, almost without fanfare or dramatic turning point, the Lehman Brothers began to shift their gaze from the shelves of their dry goods store toward the very commodity that made the South wealthy: cotton. It is easy to gloss over this transition, to jump from merchant to merchant prince without pausing. But there is something worth sitting with in this moment of change. The brothers did not abandon their store, not immediately, not completely. Rather, they extended it. A customer who came in seeking cloth might also be a planter with cotton to sell. A farmer might need supplies and also have produce or raw materials to trade. As connections accumulated, as trust deepened, the brothers began to serve not merely as retailers, but as intermediaries. They held goods, they made connections, they took on risk by extending credit. This was the invisible thread connecting a small dry goods operation in Alabama to what would one day become one of the great financial houses of America. The Montgomery store seems, in retrospect, almost impossibly humble, a beginning so modest that you might wonder how anything of significance could grow from it. And yet, this is precisely what gives the early Lehman story its peculiar character. There were no inherited fortunes behind these men, no family connections to established banking houses, no capital raised through influence or proximity to power. There was only the steady accumulation of trust through honest dealing, the careful expansion of what was possible through what was already at hand. A dry goods store, a few bolts of fabric, careful bookkeeping, and the willingness to understand what customers truly needed. What we are witnessing, without quite realizing it yet, is the birth of something that would eventually matter very much indeed. But in the 1840s and early 1850s, it was simply a family business, growing into something slightly larger than it had been. The Lehman Brothers were not yet famous. They were not even particularly wealthy by the standards of their time. They were immigrants who had started with nothing and had built something modest and stable. And yet, in that stability, in that willingness to understand the patterns of commerce and respond to them faithfully, the true foundation of Lehman Brothers was being laid, not in a moment of dramatic vision or brilliant strategy, but in the quiet, daily work of honoring your word and knowing your customers' needs. And so the Lehman Brothers, having established themselves in the modest rhythms of a dry goods merchant's life, began to notice something extraordinary shifting around them. The cotton that moved through Montgomery, Alabama in those 1840s and 1850s was not merely cloth or commodity. It was, in a very real sense, the lifeblood of an entire American economy. The South was building wealth on its cultivation, the North was building mills on its processing, and somewhere in between, in the hands of merchants and brokers and dealers, cotton became something else entirely. It became negotiable, it became tradable, it became, in the most fundamental sense, financial. The Lehman Brothers watched this transformation with the careful eye of men who understood value. What had begun as Henry, Emmanuel, and Mayer selling fabric and sundries to the growing population of Alabama was quietly becoming something more nuanced. The real opportunity, they would have begun to understand, was not in the simple buying and selling of physical goods. The opportunity was in the movement of goods themselves, in the timing of their transport, in the agreements struck between planters and mills, in the letters of credit and the contracts that bound seller to buyer across vast distances. This is where capital lived. This is where profit bloomed in ways that a simple markup could never achieve. By the 1850s, the brothers had begun their pivot. Lehman and Company, the original entity, gradually shifted its focus from being merchants who happened to trade in cotton to becoming something far more sophisticated, brokers and factors in the cotton trade itself. A factor, in the language of that time, was a middle figure, an intermediary of considerable trust and responsibility. A planter in the interior of Alabama would bring his harvest to a factor in a river town or coastal city. The factor would receive it, store it, arrange its sale, and provide credit to the planter in the interim. The factor would take a commission, but more than that, the factor would build relationships. He would know the mills of New England by name. He would understand the cotton markets of Liverpool and Manchester. He would read the newspapers from distant cities to understand demand, supply, price fluctuation, all the invisible forces that moved through commerce. This is what Henry and Emmanuel and Mayer Lehman understood, that information, timing, and trust were worth far more than inventory. When you are a merchant, you own goods. When you are a factor or broker, you orchestrate the movement of goods, and in that orchestration, you capture value. The risk is different, the skill required is different, and the wealth that can accumulate is vastly greater. The firm began to engage more deeply in what was called cotton factoring. They would advance credit to planters before the harvest, knowing that come autumn, those planters would bring their cotton to them for sale. They maintained warehouses, they managed logistics, they corresponded with buyers in distant places, negotiating prices, arranging transportation via steamboat and later railway. In doing so, they accumulated knowledge of the market, knowledge of which buyers were reliable, knowledge of which planters were trustworthy and which were not. This knowledge became their most valuable asset. And knowledge, in the world of finance, naturally accumulates into something deeper. Once you understand how cotton flows from field to mill, it is a natural step to wonder about the financing of that flow. What if a mill needed capital to expand? What if a planter needed not just a single season's credit, but funds to improve his land? What if a merchant in a neighboring state needed to stock his shelves for the coming year? The Lehman Brothers found themselves positioned at a nexus, and at such nexuses, financial institutions are born. In 1858, a formal partnership was established. Lehman Brothers was officially founded as a banking and brokerage concern. This was a threshold moment, though it may not have felt dramatic at the time. A sign was painted, papers were drawn. The brothers shifted from operating as merchants who ventured into finance to operating as financiers who understood commerce. The distinction matters greatly, though it might have seemed subtle to an observer on an Alabama street. What is crucial to understand about this transition is that it reflects a fundamental pattern in how financial institutions emerge from practical commerce. You do not begin by deciding to become a bank. You begin by solving problems. You solve one problem, then another. Each solution reveals new possibilities. Each relationship built opens doors to further relationships. The Lehman Brothers did not invent a new model of banking. Rather, they evolved organically into a new role, driven by the demands of the market they served and the trust they had accumulated within their community. The firm remained deeply tied to cotton and to Alabama for several more decades. They would not move to New York until after the Civil War, when the center of American finance was shifting irrevocably northward. But in those antebellum years, in the offices of Lehman Brothers in Montgomery, something essential was taking root. They were learning the language of capital. They were building networks across regions and across borders. They were beginning to understand that a financial house is built not on goods stored in a warehouse, but on information, judgment, and the willingness of other people to trust your word. The brothers themselves would not live to see the full scope of what they had created. Yet in those early decades, there was already a kind of permanence emerging, a name, a reputation, a network of relationships that extended far beyond what any single merchant could maintain. This is how dynasties begin, not with grand pronouncements, but with small decisions made with care, repeated over years, slowly accumulating weight and substance until something that started as a family business becomes an institution. The American nation that emerged from the smoke of Appomattox was a different creature entirely. Reconstruction moved forward with uncertain steps, and in the southern states where the Lehman family had built their mercantile life, the old world was unmistakably ending. Cotton plantations lay fallow. The labor systems that had powered the antebellum economy were dissolving into legal ambiguity and human suffering. The Lehmans, who had prospered precisely because they understood how to move cotton from field to merchant to broker, found themselves at a threshold. What happens to a business built on the rhythms of a world that no longer exists? For most families, the answer would have been decline, perhaps extinction. But the Lehmans possessed something more valuable than sentiment or nostalgia. They possessed adaptability. And they possessed something else too. A growing intuition that the real wealth in cotton was not in owning the fiber itself, but in being the intermediary, the trusted hand through which it flowed. This was a subtle but profound shift in thinking, one that would define the century ahead. By the late 1860s, Henry, Emmanuel, and Maya Lehman, the first generation now mostly passing into the hands of their sons, made a calculated decision. Montgomery, for all its historical importance to their enterprise, was becoming provincial. The railroads that would remake American commerce were being laid toward the north. Capital was concentrating in a single place, and that place was New York. The great financial machinery of the nation was assembling itself along the canyons of Lower Manhattan. If the Lehmans were to survive the transition from the Old South to the New America, they would need to move where the pulse of finance beat fastest. So imagine the journey itself, rendered in the sensory details of the era. Not a flight, but a deliberate movement. The Lehman partners and their families would have traveled by rail, watching the landscape transform through the windows, from red clay and sparse pine forests into the increasing density of a modernizing Northeast. They would have crossed into states where factories replaced plantations, where smoke rose from furnaces instead of fields, where the hum of industrial machinery had begun to drown out the rhythms of agriculture. And somewhere along that journey, perhaps during a brief stop in a bustling station, one might imagine the quiet thought, "We are leaving one world and entering another. There would be no return to what was." New York in 1870 presented a chaos of opportunity. The city was already becoming the financial capital it would remain for the next century and a half. The stock exchange had relocated to its building on Broad Street, surrounded now by granite and marble structures that seemed to announce permanence. The telegraph wires connected distant markets in real time. The commodity exchanges, where everything from wheat to sugar to cotton moved through human hands and ledgers, represented the sinews of American trade. And cotton, still, remained central to this machinery. The American South still produced it. And now, after years of disruption, production was recovering. The mills of New England and the world beyond still demanded it. Someone had to be the trusted intermediary between supply and desperate hunger. The Lehman Brothers, as the firm was now formally known, established themselves on Wall Street proper. The exact address has faded into the texture of history, but their presence did not fade. They obtained a seat on the New York Cotton Exchange, a designation that mattered immensely. It meant official recognition. It meant access to the trading floor where prices were set through the collective decisions of dozens of men gesturing and shouting in a choreography that seemed chaotic to outsiders but followed deep logic to those who understood the game. To hold a seat on an exchange was to be part of the mechanism itself. It was to have a voice in what things cost. What exactly transpired on the trading floor of the Cotton Exchange in those early years is lost to us now, embedded in ledgers that have turned to dust or been committed to archives where they sleep in climate-controlled silence. But we know the architecture of these spaces. They were typically divided into a main trading ring, surrounded by galleries where observers could watch, or where clerks could record the prices called out by the traders. The air would have been thick with heat and human voices. Ticker machines would have clattered, printing out prices on thin paper. The smell of tobacco and human effort would have hung in the air, mingling with the smell of dust from the cotton samples themselves, which buyers examined constantly to ensure quality. For the Lehmans, this was a transition from being merchants of cotton to being merchants of cotton futures, an abstraction of remarkable sophistication. A future is essentially a promise, a contract that says, "I agree to sell you this cotton at this price on this date in the future." This allows farmers to know, before they've even planted, what their harvest might be worth. It allows mills to lock in their costs, and it allows traders and brokers, firms like Lehman Brothers, to make their living on the small differences in price, on commission, on the trust that their clients place in them to execute these transactions efficiently and fairly. The cotton exchange itself was a product of the post-war era. It had been founded in 1870, the same year the Lehmans were establishing their New York presence. This was not coincidence, but rather evidence of how accurately they read the currents of the time. An institution and a firm, arriving together to meet a need that was only then becoming clear. Both would grow up together in the nervous, energetic atmosphere of Reconstruction-era finance. Do you notice what has shifted in their position? They are no longer the men buying cotton from plantation owners and selling it to shippers. They have become something subtler and more powerful. They have become the broker, the trusted intermediary through whom information and capital flow. They are no longer tied to geography, to a particular place or people, but rather to a system, and systems, once they develop their own logic, become nearly immortal. A merchant can fail, a plantation can be destroyed, but a system reproduces itself. It perpetuates its own necessity. This move to New York, this acquisition of a seat on the cotton exchange, was therefore not simply a business decision, it was a kind of metamorphosis. The Lehmans were shedding the identity of Southern merchants and becoming something more abstract, more structural, more deeply embedded in the machinery of American finance itself. They were becoming the kind of institution that thinks not in terms of years or decades, but in terms of systems and cycles. And in becoming so, they were also becoming the kind of institution that could not easily fail, but also, and this is worth noting even here, in this quieter moment, the kind of institution that when it did fail, would fail in a way that reverberated outward to touch millions of lives. But that is a story for later in the night. For now, simply know that the Lehmans had found their place, their purpose, their geography. They had come to New York and entered into the machinery of modern finance, and in doing so, they had committed themselves to a long, complicated relationship with that machinery, a relationship that would define not only their own fortune, but would eventually intertwine their fate with the fate of a nation. The New York that the Lehman Brothers were entering in the decades after the Civil War was a city in the midst of a strange and glittering transformation. The financial district below Wall Street itself had begun to take on a character that was entirely new to American commerce, a vertical landscape of ambition, where the old orderly rhythms of trade were being replaced by something faster, more abstract, more dependent on paper and promise than on the goods that paper represented. And if you had walked through those narrow streets in the 1880s or 1890s, you would have encountered a world whose textures and sensations were unlike anything that exists in finance today. The offices themselves were suffused with a particular kind of light, not the cool fluorescence that would one day illuminate trading floors, but rather the warm, slightly trembling glow of gas lamps, flames contained in glass, casting shadows that seemed to move with intention across the walls of narrow rooms. The ledgers that lined the shelves of these offices were objects of genuine craft, their pages sewn and bound by hand, the paper heavy and slightly yellowed, even when new. Clerks with careful penmanship would spend entire days entering figures in these ledgers, using fountain pens that required constant care, constant refilling. Every number was a commitment, recorded in ink that was meant to last. There was something in that permanence, in the visible weight of record-keeping, that created a different relationship to accuracy than exists when numbers are entered into machines and can be altered with a keystroke. The ethics of Wall Street during this period were complicated, shall we say. The men who controlled the great banking houses operated within a framework of law that was far less restrictive than what would eventually come into being. There were no securities commissions, no regulatory bodies overseeing disclosure. A banker's word, his reputation, his family name, these were the things that mattered most. And yet it was precisely because reputation was so central that a certain code developed, unwritten but powerful. To be known as a house that defaulted, that misrepresented itself, that engaged in outright fraud, such a reputation would follow a firm for generations. The consequences were not fines or prison terms in most cases, but rather the slow erosion of trust, the gradual withdrawal of capital, the eventual collapse of the enterprise itself. This created an interesting paradox. On one hand, there were certainly men engaged in genuine deception, stock manipulations, corner schemes where a small group of financiers would attempt to control the supply of a particular security and force prices upward artificially. These schemes were not illegal, or at least not clearly so, but they were also not respectable. There was a hierarchy of dishonesty, one might say. Some kinds of financial manipulation were considered clever, even admirable. Others were regarded as beyond the pale, as the sorts of things a gentleman would not do, which in that context was a punishment more severe than most legal penalties could impose. The Lehman Brothers, as they established themselves in New York and expanded their operations into investment banking, seem to have been men who placed considerable weight on their standing as reliable, careful operators. Their cotton trading business had been built on the assumption that they would honor their commitments, that their word meant something, and as they began to underwrite securities, to float bonds for emerging railroads and industrial concerns, this reputation became their most valuable asset. When a company wanted to raise capital by issuing stock or bonds, investors needed to believe that the information they were receiving was honest, or at least honest to the extent that the underwriting bank's reputation would be tarnished if fraud were discovered. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A young man working as a trader or a clerk in a Lehman Brothers office in the 1880s or 1890s would have been acutely aware that his personal reputation was bound up with the reputation of the house. The firm was, in many cases, still very much a family enterprise. The senior partners were known men, men who attended the same clubs, who lived in the same neighborhoods, whose families moved in the same circles. If the firm was caught engaging in dishonest dealings, it was not merely the firm that would suffer, but the families themselves, their social standing, their marriage prospects, their place in society. This may sound quaint now, distant and almost naive, and in many ways it was. There was certainly plenty of financial manipulation and outright theft occurring on Wall Street during this period, but there was also something in that social pressure, in the embedding of financial operations within networks of personal relationship and family reputation, that created certain restraints on behavior. The abstraction of modern finance, where traders operate through screens and execute transactions at the speed of light, where they may never meet their counterparties, where their own identity is subsumed into the institutional identity of the bank. This removes some of the moral friction that existed when finance was a more personal affair. The offices where Lehman conducted its business would have been austere by modern standards. Wooden desks arranged in rows, with partners occupying rooms with actual doors, those doors typically made of frosted glass that allowed light to penetrate but not sight. The partners' rooms would have had a certain formality, leather chairs, perhaps a portrait or two, a safe for holding valuable documents and cash. The general clerking areas would have been more Spartan, hard chairs, the constant sound of pens scratching against paper, the occasional murmur of conversation kept deliberately low. There was a hierarchy of space, a visual and auditory expression of rank and position. And what was the substance of what went on in these spaces? Endless negotiation, really. The underwriting of a new security issue might take weeks or months of negotiation between the issuing company and the banking house. There were meetings with lawyers, accountants, other bankers. There were negotiations with the stock exchanges about whether a particular security would be listed. There were conversations with existing shareholders about how a new issue might affect their holdings. Everything moved at the speed of conversation, correspondence, the occasional face-to-face meeting. There were no conference calls, no video screens, no instant communication. If you needed to discuss something urgent with someone in another city, you either sent a telegram or got on a train. This slowness, paradoxically, may have created a different kind of risk assessment. When every transaction took significant time to arrange, when the friction in the system was high, there was perhaps more opportunity for doubt to creep in. For someone to pause and ask whether the deal made sense, whether the numbers seemed right, whether the underlying value justified the price being asked. The speed of modern finance, by contrast, can sometimes create a kind of momentum that overwhelms doubt, that makes pausing and questioning feel like an obstacle to progress rather than a necessary part of prudence. The Lehman Brothers and the other banking houses of their era were, in this sense, working in a world that operated under different constraints and different rhythms. And yet they were also building something that would eventually transform itself beyond recognition. The investment banking function that Lehman was developing, the act of raising capital for growing companies, of serving as an intermediary between those who had capital and those who needed it, this was the seed from which the modern financial system would grow. The ethics, the personal oversight, the weight of reputation, these would gradually fade, replaced by larger institutions, more complex structures, and eventually systems so abstract that the human element seemed almost to disappear from the equation entirely. But that was still many decades away. For now, in the gaslit offices of Lower Manhattan, the Lehman Brothers were building their empire, one careful, handwritten transaction at a time. The firm's position in New York had settled into something almost comfortable by the 1880s, the kind of comfort that comes from knowing every merchant who walks through your door, every shipping manifest, every cotton price fluctuation. But even as Lehman consolidated its grip on the commodities exchanges, the world around it was changing in ways that would demand an entirely different skill. The great retail palaces were beginning to rise, those monumental stores with plate-glass windows and electric lights, temples to a new kind of American abundance, and someone had to finance them. Consider what it meant to build a department store in that era. Not a modest shop on Main Street, but a 6-story or 8-story or 10-story monument to merchandise, with hundreds of employees, elaborate elevator systems, pneumatic tube networks to whisk cash and receipts between floors. The capital required was staggering. A merchant prince like Marshall Field or R.H. Macy needed not simply a loan but an architect of finance, someone who understood not just the mathematics of credit, but the very nature of retail itself, someone who could look at a building rising in Chicago or New York and see not just concrete and steel, but the future volume of transactions flowing through its doors. This was where Lehman Brothers found its next opening. The family's decades of experience in commodities trading had taught them something invaluable: how to read a market, how to gauge supply and demand, how to understand the character of merchants and manufacturers. Those skills translated almost directly into a new kind of work. Instead of financing the movement of cotton or coffee, they could finance the systems that would sell the finished goods that cotton and coffee helped create. The first great opportunity came with Richard Warren Sears and Alvar Fisher, who in the 1890s had begun experimenting with a revolutionary idea: selling merchandise by catalog, by mail order, to the vast rural populations of America who had no access to city stores. Sears, Roebuck and Company grew with astonishing speed. But growth demanded money, and it demanded credit arrangements that the traditional banking system was reluctant to provide to enterprises so new and so unconventional. Here were men selling unseen goods to customers they would never meet, promising delivery across distances that made accountability uncertain. It was, in conventional eyes, a precarious enterprise. But Lehman Brothers saw something different. The partners recognized the underlying logic. If you could standardize merchandise, if you could coordinate transportation, if you could manage the logistics of distribution across a nation's railways, you could make a fortune. And if you could finance the man who figured that out, you might make a fortune as well. The engagement with Sears brought Lehman into a new world entirely. This was not the intimate, personal relationship of commodity trading. This was investment banking in its deeper sense, studying a business plan, understanding its vulnerabilities, assessing its growth potential, and then standing ready to underwrite its expansion in the public markets. When Sears needed to raise capital, when expansion required more money than the founders and their current investors could provide, Lehman Brothers could navigate that company from private ownership into the realm of public shareholders. Macy's, too, became part of this expanding universe. The New York store, already legendary for its Thanksgiving Day parade and its promise to hold sales for customers regardless of the price they paid, wanted to expand into additional locations. The Macy family needed partners who could help them raise capital without losing control of what they had built. Lehman Brothers became that partner. Year after year, the firm stood behind these retail dynasties, lending credibility and capital to enterprises that were reshaping American commerce. There was something almost graceful about this transition, though it was never described in those terms at the time. The Lehmans and their senior partners were simply following the logic of their own experience, using the relationships and the knowledge they had accumulated to move into territory where those assets held particular value. They were not inventing investment banking. That enterprise had other origins and other practitioners, but they were learning to speak its language, to understand its mechanics, to position themselves as reliable intermediaries between entrepreneurs with grand ambitions and investors with capital-seeking returns. What made Lehman different in this work was something harder to quantify. It was partly the family's merchant background, that inherited assumption that you understood your customers, that you knew their business not merely in the abstract, but through countless conversations and years of accumulated trust. It was partly the firm's geographic diversity, having roots in Alabama and Texas and New York, gave the partners a sensibility that was neither purely Southern nor purely Eastern, but something in between. And it was partly the specific moment in which they entered this new arena. The American retail explosion was still in its infancy. The department stores and catalog companies were still run by men who remembered their founding, who maintained personal oversight, who could explain their business to a careful banker over multiple meetings. Lehman Brothers positioned itself as the kind of firm that understood not just the numbers, but the men behind them. The work of underwriting a retail company's growth became, in its own way, a form of storytelling. A partner at Lehman would need to convince potential investors that they should pour their money into stores in cities they had never visited, into merchandise categories they had never considered, into a vision of the future that was still taking shape. To do that effectively, he needed to understand the story deeply enough to tell it convincingly, to know its vulnerabilities well enough to acknowledge them without undermining confidence, to grasp the possibilities vividly enough to make them seem inevitable. It was not so different, really, from what the Lehman Brothers themselves had done when they first arrived in Montgomery, trying to convince New York cotton merchants to trust their judgment about what was happening in the southern cotton market. As the firm moved deeper into the 20th century, this investment banking work would become ever more central to its identity. The commodity trading business would eventually fade into the background, eventually disappear entirely. But for now, in the closing years of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th, the transition was gradual, almost unnoticed. Lehman Brothers was becoming something new, while remaining, in its essential character, something very old, a family business built on understanding their clients and keeping their word. As the new century turned and the calendar marked 1900, a certain quietness settled into the offices of Lehman Brothers. The firm had already survived 60 years, a respectable age for any enterprise, and its reputation for steady dealing had become something like an unspoken contract with its clients. But it was during these early decades of the 20th century that the true architecture of the modern Lehman Brothers would be constructed, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, in the capable hands of a man named Philip Lehman. Philip Lehman was not a flashy figure. Unlike some of his contemporaries who wore their wealth like jewelry and their ambitions like banners across New York's skyline, Philip moved through his world with a kind of deliberate restraint. He had inherited not just a business from his father Emmanuel, but a philosophy that lasting power was built on patience, that fortunes made too quickly were fortunes that could evaporate just as swiftly. There was something almost meditative about his approach to finance, a quality that served him extraordinarily well as the American economy itself began to transform in ways both exhilarating and precarious. The early 20th century was a moment of vast industrial becoming. Railroads were spreading across the continent like capillaries, carrying blood to a vast and hungry body. Steel mills were rising, factories were multiplying. The question that animated every serious banker in those days was this: who would finance this expansion? Who could be trusted to understand not just the numbers on a ledger, but the deeper currents of industry and ambition that moved beneath them? And Philip Lehman, with his family's 3 generations of cotton dealings and financial acuity, seemed to understand intuitively that the real opportunity lay not in cotton anymore, but in the emerging industries that would remake American civilization. During the early 1900s, Philip began to shift the firm's focus subtly, almost imperceptibly. The cotton business did not disappear. Old relationships are seldom severed cleanly, but it became less central to the firm's identity. Instead, Philip and his partners began to position Lehman Brothers as what we might call an industrial financier. They extended credit to manufacturers. They helped structure deals between enterprises that had never dealt together before. They built networks, not as a spider builds a web to trap prey, but as a gardener builds trellises for vines to climb. The relationships themselves became the product. One might ask, what separated Lehman Brothers from dozens of other banking houses that were doing similar things? The answer, perhaps, was Philip's particular gift for reading people and institutions. He seemed to possess an almost intuitive sense of which enterprises would last and which were merely riding a temporary current of enthusiasm. He invested his firm's reputation carefully, which meant he sometimes declined profitable opportunities because he sensed, through some method he could not entirely articulate, that they would lead to loss. This caution, in a period of extraordinary optimism and speculation, was not always popular. Some viewed it as timidity, but it would in time prove prescient. The firm remained, throughout the first decade of the 20th century, relatively private in its operations. There was no advertising, no grand announcements. The way word spread about Lehman Brothers was the way important things have always spread in the world of high finance. Through quiet conversations between men who trusted one another, through letters written on heavy cream paper, through handshakes that meant something because the men involved had the power to make them mean something. Philip Lehman understood that in finance, perhaps more than in any other realm of human endeavor, reputation is not merely an asset, it is the asset. Everything else flows from it. And yet, during these decades, the firm was growing. The office at 44 Wall Street, which had housed Lehman Brothers since their establishment in New York after the Civil War, was increasingly crowded with clerks and analysts and junior partners. More space was being rented, more correspondence was arriving daily. The telegraph and the telephone were shrinking distances that had once seemed vast. A decision made in New York could affect operations in Chicago or Boston within hours. Philip Lehman grasped this new reality and began to expand the firm's reach accordingly. In the background of all this steady, unremarkable progress were the great currents of American life. Immigration was continuing in vast waves. Cities were growing into monsters of brick and iron. Labor was becoming organized, sometimes violently. But within the confines of Lehman Brothers, there was a kind of stability, a sense that certain principles, honesty, prudence, the long view, were immutable. Philip Lehman embodied these principles. He was not a colorful character. He would not be the subject of popular biographies or sensational newspaper articles. But he was the kind of man upon whom institutions are built. The kind of man whose absence is felt not immediately, but only gradually, when unexpected failures begin to accumulate. Through the first and second decades of the 20th century, Lehman Brothers gradually shifted its center of gravity. The firm began to engage more directly in what would become known as investment banking, that is, helping companies raise capital through stock and bond offerings, rather than simply lending them money and taking collateral. This required a different kind of expertise, a different set of connections, a more sophisticated understanding of the machinery of modern capital markets. Philip Lehman and his partners began to cultivate relationships with the largest industrial corporations in America. They positioned themselves as advisors, not merely as lenders. This positioning would pay dividends, literal and otherwise, for decades to come. Consider what this shift required. Philip Lehman had to train his eye not just on the cotton exchanges of the South or the general commodity markets, but on the emerging landscape of American industry. He had to understand railroads deeply, which meant understanding not just their financial statements, but the routes they traveled, the cargo they moved, the men who ran them. He had to understand the steel industry, which meant grasping the differences between Bessemer process and open hearth production, the geography of ore deposits, the competition between Pittsburgh and other mills. He had to understand the early automobile industry, the electrical industry, the chemical industry. This was not the work of one man, certainly, but of a partnership of minds, all working under Philip's steady direction. What emerges from the historical record, though much of it is quiet and unremarkable, is a picture of extraordinary competence and restraint. Philip Lehman did not seek prominence. He did not accumulate vast personal wealth in the ostentatious style of the great robber barons of the era. He lived comfortably, certainly, but with a kind of self-imposed modesty that set him apart from many of his peers. This may have been a product of his family's old-fashioned values. The Lehmans had always been merchants first, accumulators of wealth second. Or it may have been Philip's own temperament, his sense that the accumulation of mere wealth was less significant than the building of something enduring. As the 1920s approached, Lehman Brothers had transformed itself almost without announcement. It was no longer primarily a cotton house. It was no longer primarily a lender. It had become a financial advisor to major American corporations, a firm trusted to help structure some of the most important deals in the American economy. This transformation had occurred not through acquisition or merger, not through grand strategic pronouncements, but through the slow, steady accumulation of successful relationships and the careful reputation management that Philip Lehman practiced like a form of quiet art. The question that the next decade would pose though no one could have known it was coming, was whether any reputation, no matter how carefully built, could survive what was about to unfold. The October morning of 1929 arrived like any other, except it did not. The men who had built empires on confidence found that confidence, it seemed, was the only currency that mattered. And when it evaporated, suddenly, without warning, in the panic of 1,000 voices shouting "Sell, sell, sell" across the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, everything that had been built on that confidence began, quietly at first, then with terrifying speed, to crumble. The Lehman Brothers partnership had survived for 85 years. They had weathered the Civil War, the panic of 1893, the tremors and adjustments of the industrial age. But nothing had prepared them, or anyone, for the sheer magnitude of what was coming. The firm's reputation had been built on prudence, on relationships, on a certain old-world caution that had seemed, in the booming 20s, almost timid. While other houses had rushed into every new opportunity, had leveraged themselves to extraordinary heights, Lehman had maintained what one might call a conservative posture. They had not gambled recklessly, they had not overextended. And yet the market's collapse did not discriminate between the cautious and the foolish. The depression that followed was a kind of universal reckoning, a slow suffocation of the entire financial system, and Lehman Brothers found themselves, like everyone else, gasping. In those first years after the crash, when the economy seemed to be descending into an bottomless pit, the firm faced a choice that would define not only their immediate future, but their entire character. Would they contract? Would they retreat into themselves, pull in their capital, lay off their people, and simply wait for calmer times? Many firms did exactly this. Many firms did not survive the waiting. Lehman Brothers, under the steady guidance of Robert Lehman, who had assumed greater control as his father Philip aged, made a different choice. It was not a bold choice. It was not a gamble. It was, in fact, a choice rooted in the same philosophy that had sustained the firm for nearly a century. They would endure. They would maintain their commitments. They would keep their offices open, their partners employed, their relationships intact. Think for a moment about what this meant. During the Depression, when capital was precious, when every dollar seemed like the last dollar that would ever exist, the firm chose to spend it. They chose to keep paying their people. They chose to remain active in their markets, modest as those markets had become, offering credit when credit was nearly impossible to find, maintaining the connections that would matter when the world eventually began to move again. Robert Lehman was a different sort of man than his father had been. Philip Lehman, who had guided the firm through the industrial boom at the turn of the century, had possessed a certain iron will, a businessman's ruthlessness tempered by family loyalty. Robert Lehman was more intellectual. He had studied law. He had developed a genuine interest in art and culture. There was something almost scholarly about his approach to finance, as if he viewed the movements of money and markets as part of some larger, grander tapestry of human civilization. And perhaps that perspective served the firm well during those desperate years, because maintaining commitments when doing so is easy, is no commitment at all. What matters is maintaining them when the price is high, when every instinct tells you to save yourself, when fear is whispering that the world will never recover, that this darkness is permanent, that you are a fool to spend money on anything but survival. Lehman did not panic. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. Imagine the pressure. Imagine the partners gathering in their offices, watching their portfolios collapse, watching the markets that had once seemed like infinite engines of wealth simply shut down. Imagine the temptation, the almost irresistible urge to abandon the principles that had guided the firm in better times. And yet they held. They held through the early 1930s, when conditions only worsened. They held as unemployment climbed toward 20%. They held as breadlines formed on American streets and farms collapsed, and entire towns simply emptied out, people moving westward in search of work that did not exist. The rebuilding, when it began, was gradual. There was no dramatic moment when conditions suddenly reversed. Recovery from the depression was not a matter of waking up one morning to find that everything was well again. It was a slow, incremental process. A client returns, a small opportunity presents itself. Capital begins hesitantly to move again. Confidence does not flood back. It seeps back, molecule by molecule, like water returning to an empty well. By the late 1930s, Lehman Brothers had positioned itself remarkably well for the world that was emerging. They had capital. They had people who remembered how to do business. They had relationships that had endured the worst depression in American history. And they had, perhaps most importantly, a reputation for integrity that had only been strengthened by their refusal to abandon their commitments during the darkest days. When World War II came, and the American economy transformed itself once again into a war machine, it was the firms that had survived the depression intact that found themselves best positioned to participate in the financing of that vast mobilization. And Lehman, quiet Lehman, cautious Lehman, the firm that had nearly seemed timid in the exuberant 20s, was there. They were there when contracts were let. They were there when factories needed to be built and armies needed to be supplied. They were there not because they had bet correctly or because they had taken enormous risks, but because they had chosen, in the hardest moment, to be the kind of institution that could be relied upon. There is something deeply restful about that thought, is there not? The idea that endurance, that simple persistence, that the refusal to break one's word even when the cost is high, that these things matter, that they have weight in the world, that they shape not just the immediate moment but the decades that follow. In the earliest days of banking, before regulatory bodies and government guarantees, before deposit insurance or central banks standing ready to catch a falling institution, there existed something far more fragile than any ledger or vault of gold. There was reputation. A single whispered doubt about a banker's integrity could trigger a run that drained his coffers within hours. A merchant's confidence in a firm's word could take generations to build and mere moments to shatter. And it was this intangible currency that allowed Lehman Brothers, a family house with modest origins and no inherited aristocracy, to survive through booms and catastrophes that buried older, supposedly grander names. Consider for a moment what it means to trust a financial institution in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You place your savings with a banker not because the government promises to protect your deposit. You do it because you believe that banker will wake every morning committed to safeguarding your trust. You believe he will make decisions with restraint rather than recklessness. You believe that when pressures mount and opportunities arise to bend the rules or take shortcuts, he will instead hold firm to his reputation as a man of principle. In that context, a firm's survival becomes almost a moral achievement. The Lehman family understood this intuitively. For more than a century, through the Civil War and its aftermath, through the Gilded Age's wild speculation and repeated panics, through the absolute devastation of 1929, the name Lehman remained solvent and respected. When other firms failed, theirs endured. When doubt spread across Wall Street, some depositors and business partners still chose to trust Lehman. Why? Because the firm had, again and again, chosen caution over excess. It had weathered storms not by taking refuge in denial, but by acknowledging trouble early and adjusting course. It had built relationships based not on promises of spectacular returns, but on the simple, profound guarantee that their capital would be managed with care. There is something almost meditative in contemplating how slowly trust accumulates, how patiently it must be cultivated. Each successful transaction, each handled crisis, Each promise kept, even when unfashionable or unprofitable, adds an invisible layer to a bank's reputation. The Lehman name became, quite literally, an asset on their balance sheet. When other firms struggled to borrow or attract capital, Lehman's ability to raise funds at favorable rates was itself a form of wealth. Counterparties accepted their terms more readily. Clients granted them access to larger deals. Regulators extended them a certain latitude because the record of restraint preceded them. And here we arrive at a paradox that would echo through the firm's entire history. The very reputational capital that had protected Lehman through a century of turbulence was earned through a culture of internal discipline, through partnerships and leadership structures that encouraged long-term thinking. Philip Lehman, guiding the firm through and beyond the Depression, embodied a kind of banker whose calculus included not just quarterly profits, but the firm's standing 50 years hence. Robert Lehman, inheriting that stewardship, added to the legacy not by taking greater risks, but by proving that restraint itself could generate wealth. The firm's survival through the crash of 1929, when so many contemporary rivals perished, rested partly on being positioned defensively before disaster struck. They had not taken on the maximum leverage available to them. They had not pursued every opportunity. They had maintained a margin of safety. There is a quiet dignity in this approach that seems almost quaint now, listening from our vantage point at the end of Lehman's story. Yet for more than a century, this philosophy worked. It protected employees. It rewarded loyal partners. It allowed the firm to hire and retain talent, not through promises of instant riches, but through the security of working for an institution that would likely still exist a decade hence. Reputation, in other words, is not mere decoration on a bank's facade. It is functional. It is operational. It reduces costs, widens opportunity, and creates buffers against sudden shocks. What happens, though, when the institutional memory that preserves a reputation begins to fade? When the founding partners and their children and their children's children gradually depart, their personal codes and priorities replaced by a new generation of professional managers who did not watch a Great Depression or navigate the immediate aftermath of market collapse. When profits begin to drive decisions rather than the long-term health of the franchise. These are not accusatory questions, but rather the kind that ripple through any large institution that changes hands across generations. The reputation capital accumulated so slowly and so carefully over 100 years remains on the balance sheet. But the mechanisms that had preserved it, the cultural guardrails, and the mentorship from elders who had witnessed catastrophe, begin to atrophy. The transition from family stewardship to professional management is never swift or clean. It happens imperceptibly at first, through small adjustments in hiring practices, through the gradual elevation of traders over relationship managers, through performance metrics that reward short-term gains. And the reputation capital, that magnificent cushion built across generations, begins to work differently. Instead of restraining ambition, it enables it. The name Lehman, so long associated with solidity, now opens doors to greater leverage, larger risks, bolder positions. Counterparties are willing to extend more credit because the reputation is there. But the cultural practices that had earned the reputation, the caution, the long-view thinking, the understanding that some deals should be declined, those are not automatically transmitted. They must be consciously passed down and fiercely protected. And that protection requires constant vigilance. And so we have, embedded in Lehman's history, a subtle meditation on the nature of institutional inheritance. What does a firm inherit when a patriarch dies? The ledgers, yes, and the client relationships, and the real estate and the cash. But does it inherit the judgment that created those assets? Does it inherit the humility about financial cycles, the understanding that markets sometimes turn, and that survival depends on having prepared for that turning? Or does it inherit only the appearance of solidity, which, without the substance beneath it, becomes fragile as paper? For a long time, Lehman coasted on the strength of its reputation, and that coasting was itself a form of safety. But reputations do not replenish themselves. They must be actively maintained through decisions that sometimes feel expensive in the moment, through the discipline to say no, through the willingness to forgo profits that would require bending principles. Lehman had demonstrated this willingness for 100 years. The question, as the firm entered the 21st century and its leadership became increasingly removed from the shadows of the Depression, was whether that demonstration could echo forward across time, or whether reputation could remain strong even as the culture that had earned it quietly transformed into something entirely different. In the years following the Second World War, as American soldiers returned to a nation that had emerged from conflict not diminished but strengthened, there arose a peculiar and almost dreamlike optimism about what technology and capital might accomplish together. And it was in this atmosphere of possibility, this sense that the future was not something to be feared but invested in, that Lehman Brothers began to chart a course that would carry it deeper into the machinery of American ambition than ever before. The Depression and the war had taught the firm something essential about survival. Robert Lehman, who had inherited not just a business, but a century of accumulated trust, understood that banking in this new era would require not merely the careful preservation of wealth, but the active financing of its creation. The old cotton trader had given way to something far larger in scope, and as commercial airlines began to imagine routes across oceans and continents, as television sets started to glow in living rooms from coast to coast, Lehman positioned itself not as a cautious observer, but as an architect of transformation. Consider the simple miracle of flight. In 1945, an airplane was still a thing of wonder and risk, a technology that demanded enormous capital and even more enormous faith. But the post-war years brought a hunger for connection. Families wanted to visit distant relatives. Businessmen needed to cross the country in hours rather than days. Airlines such as Pan American Airways, Trans World Airlines, and later the newer carriers all required financing structures that were beyond the capacity of conventional banking. They needed partners who understood both the technical possibilities and the financial mathematics of scaling an industry from something marginal to something essential. Lehman Brothers became such a partner. The firm began to underwrite securities for airlines, channeling capital from investors into the purchase of aircraft, the construction of terminals, the hiring of crews and ground staff. In doing so, it was not merely lending money. It was, in a very real sense, betting on the future of American life itself. Each bond issued, each security underwritten, was a statement of faith that people would want to fly, that the economics would work out, that innovation could be made profitable, and profitable things could transform the world. The mechanics of this were not simple, though they might appear so from a distance. Lehman would work with the airline to structure a financing package that spread the risk across many investors. A pension fund in Chicago might buy a portion, an insurance company in Boston might take another, a wealthy individual or a trust might own yet another piece. By dividing the risk, the firm made the investment possible, and by making it possible, it became indispensable. This was the art of modern banking, and Robert Lehman and his partners had learned it well. But aviation was only one of the narratives that Lehman was writing into the future. There was something else, something perhaps even more intimate in its reach, into American homes and hearts. Television. In the years after the war, television was transformed from an experimental curiosity into a mass medium. But mass media requires enormous infrastructure. It requires studios and broadcast towers and transmitters, and the constant production of programming to fill the hours. It requires capital, and more importantly, it requires the kind of capital that only an investment bank can provide. the Radio Corporation of America, the Columbia Broadcasting System, the National Broadcasting Company. These were not merely entertainment enterprises. They were industrial forces that needed to raise money in the capital markets, and they needed bankers who could translate their vision into securities that investors would buy. Lehman Brothers understood this perhaps more keenly than some of its competitors. The firm had roots in retail commerce through its earlier work with Sears and Macy's, and so it grasped something fundamental about the connection between what people wanted to buy and the capital structures that made buying possible. Television was not separate from commerce. It was, increasingly, the very engine of it. Advertising revenues would flow to broadcasters because people would watch, and people would watch because they wanted to see the products and the stories that commerce offered them. This was the emerging ecosystem of mid-century American capitalism, and Lehman was positioning itself at its center. There is something meditative in contemplating this period, a kind of historical reverie. The firm was no longer merely surviving. It was thriving in a world that seemed to promise endless growth. The trading floors were busy with the sound of dealt transactions. The offices grew larger. The partnerships expanded to include new members who brought new expertise and new ambitions. The sense was one of inevitability, of being carried forward by forces larger than any individual or even any single firm. And yet what is striking, when one considers this era with the benefit of hindsight, is the assumption that underlay it all. There was a belief that growth could continue indefinitely, that the future would always offer new opportunities for expansion and leverage, that the mechanisms of finance itself were fundamentally sound and would support whatever structures one built upon them. This belief was not unique to Lehman Brothers. It was the shared faith of an entire nation and an entire financial system. But Lehman, by its very success in this period, was also by degrees binding itself more tightly to this assumption. The firm was growing not just in size, but in complexity. New divisions were created. New specialties developed. The structure that had served for nearly a century, a partnership bound by family ties and shared responsibility, was beginning to strain under the weight of its own success. How do you maintain the careful stewardship of capital when the capital itself becomes so vast, so abstract, so removed from its original human sources? This was not a question that was often asked aloud, but it was present nonetheless, like a note at the edge of hearing. In the immediate post-war years, though, such questions seemed distant and theoretical. There was work to be done. There were industries to finance and futures to build. The war was over. America had won, and now it was time to invest in the peace, to finance the enormous industrial optimism that animated every conversation, every boardroom, every transaction on the street. By the middle years of the 20th century, Lehman Brothers had become something more than a business enterprise. It had become a living embodiment of continuity, a fortress built not from steel or stone, but from names passed down through generations, from decisions made in quiet rooms by men who carried the weight of their ancestors' prudence. And at the very center of this world stood Robert Lehman, a figure whose mere presence seemed to steady the firm through whatever storm came next. Robert had inherited not just a business, but a philosophy. His father Philip had taught him that capital was a trust, that risk was something to be measured and respected rather than courted, and that a Lehman's word mattered more than any contract written in ink. These lessons had served the firm well through the chaos of the Depression, through the uncertainty of war, and into the bright, confident decades that followed. But as the 1960s deepened, something quiet and inevitable was happening. Robert Lehman, who had guided the firm for more than 30 years, was growing older. His hair had turned silver, then white. His pace slowed, though his mind remained sharp as ever. What nobody could quite acknowledge yet was this: the family itself was beginning to fragment in ways that no amount of tradition could hold together. The post-war years had changed Wall Street. The old WASP establishments that had dominated New York finance for a century found themselves competing with a new generation of deal-makers, men who were hungrier, less tied to the old gentleman's codes of restraint. Lehman Brothers had remained a family firm through choice, but that choice was becoming harder to sustain. The younger generation of Lehmans didn't always want to sit in those mahogany offices and speak in the measured tones their grandfathers had favored. Some wanted autonomy, some wanted to pursue their own interests. The unity that had been such a source of strength was fracturing into competing ambitions and divergent visions for what the firm should become. Robert Lehman had no surviving male heir. His daughter Helen had children, but the traditions of Wall Street in the 1960s were still rigid about who could lead a major financial house. There was no clear successor waiting in the wings, no younger Lehman whose name alone could command the same authority and respect that Robert's could. This created a kind of invisible anxiety throughout the partnership. Men who had devoted their lives to the firm began to wonder what would happen when Robert was gone. Would someone from within be strong enough to hold the fractious pieces together? Or would the firm find itself adrift, vulnerable to forces it might not be equipped to resist? In his last working years, Robert labored to build what institutional stability he could. He elevated trusted lieutenants, men from outside the family, partners who had proven themselves through decades of loyal service. Their names would never have the weight of Lehman, but their competence was beyond question. It was a gentle acknowledgement that the era of family governance, unquestioned and absolute, was coming to an end. Yet how could it not? The world was changing, finance was becoming more complex, less a matter of character and reputation, and more a matter of sophisticated instruments and technical mastery. Robert Lehman died in August of 1969. He was in his 70s, and while his death was not entirely unexpected, it carried nonetheless a finality that seemed to shake something loose within the firm. The newspaper obituaries were long and respectful. They traced his journey through the Depression, his stewardship during prosperity, his role in countless major transactions. They spoke of him as a gentleman of finance, a rarity in a profession that had grown increasingly mercenary and aggressive. What the obituaries couldn't quite capture was the loss of something intangible, a steadying hand. For more than 30 years, whenever there was uncertainty or crisis, men had looked to Robert Lehman. His judgment was trusted. His conservatism was not seen as timidity, but as wisdom earned through experience. When he spoke in a partnership meeting, the room quieted. When he counseled caution, people listened because they understood that his caution had always served the firm well. With his death, that certainty evaporated. The partnership faced a kind of interregnum, a period of uncertainty about leadership and direction that had no clear resolution. The family itself was no longer unified around a single vision. Some of the younger generation wanted to modernize, to be more aggressive, to compete on Wall Street not with character, but with size and ruthlessness. Others still believed in the old ways, in the idea that Lehman's reputation for integrity and caution was its greatest asset. These factions didn't always articulate their disagreements explicitly. They simmered beneath the surface, emerging in small disputes over strategy, over which businesses to pursue, over what kind of risks the firm should take. There were committee structures put in place. There were agreements about collective decision-making. But committees have no face. They have no voice that carries the weight of a name, like Robert Lehman's name. And in a world where major financial decisions often come down to which partner can persuade a client or convince his colleagues, the absence of a universally trusted leader created a kind of power vacuum. Some historians have suggested, looking back, that the death of Robert Lehman marked the moment when Lehman Brothers began its long, slow transformation from a family firm governed by tradition into something else entirely, a partnership increasingly driven by individual ambition, by the hunger for bigger deals and faster growth, by the belief that the old cautious ways were no longer adequate in a modern world. Others argue this was natural evolution, that no institution can remain forever frozen in time, that the forces reshaping Wall Street would have transformed Lehman regardless of who sat at the top. What seems beyond dispute is that something shifted. The firm didn't immediately fall apart. It was, after all, staffed with intelligent, capable people who understood finance and who had much to lose if Lehman failed. But the shared understanding about what Lehman Brothers was, its identity, its philosophy, its place in the hierarchy of Wall Street institutions, that became far more contested. The firm entered its second century not with a clear sense of mission, but with a confusion of competing visions about where it should go. In the weeks and months after Robert's death, the partners gathered in those offices on the 31st floor of 1 William Street and tried to navigate the question that had no easy answer: who and what would lead them forward. The death of Robert Lehman in 1969 had removed something intangible from the firm's corridors, not merely a leader, but a kind of institutional gravity. For more than a century, the Lehman name had carried weight, not because it shouted, but because it endured. The family had weathered panic and depression, war and reconstruction. That steadying presence, the sense that someone at the center held a long view, began to diffuse in the years that followed. And into that space crept something restless. The 1970s arrived with their own particular turbulence. America was convulsing. Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation eating away at confidence. The stock market languished. Oil shocks rippled outward. For a firm built on the patient accumulation of relationships and reputation, the decade felt like standing in sand that would not hold still. Partnership, which had once meant something sacred at Lehman, a binding of not just capital, but judgment and family legacy, began to fragment into factions. Partners who had worked side by side for decades found themselves competing rather than collaborating. Ambitions that had been quietly held now jostled openly. It was as though the departure of Robert Lehman had removed the lid on something pressurized. Louis Glucksmann, a trader and investment banker who had risen through the ranks with uncommon hunger, found himself increasingly at odds with Peter Peterson, who represented an older, more cautious wing of the firm. Peterson believed in discipline, in measured risk, in the old codes of decorum. Glucksmann wanted velocity. He wanted Lehman to be bigger, faster, more aggressive. He wanted to capture the new energies moving through finance, the rise of institutional money, the computer-driven trading that was beginning to reshape markets, the appetite for larger and larger deals. It was not a disagreement about methods alone. It was philosophical. What should Lehman become, and who got to decide? The tension simmered throughout the 70s, unseen by the outside world but deeply felt within. There was a particular kind of pain in these internal rifts, because Lehman had always prided itself on continuity, on the idea that the firm transcended individual ego. Yet here were two powerful minds, both convinced they possessed the right vision for Lehman's future, locked in what amounted to a slow institutional civil war. Neither could eliminate the other outright. Both had constituencies. Both had been essential to various victories. The firm began to bleed talented people. Partners sensed the uncertainty and looked elsewhere. By the early 1980s, the landscape of Wall Street itself was shifting rapidly. Glass-Steagall, that regulatory wall separating commercial banking from investment banking that had stood since the Depression, was beginning to erode. Mergers and acquisitions became the central nervous system of finance. Junk bonds emerged as a force. The hostile takeover became an art form. Lehman, for all its history, found itself fighting for market share against firms that were nimbler, hungrier, less burdened by tradition. How does a 140-year-old institution compete with scrappier rivals who have nothing to lose? the question haunted the partnership. In 1983, the Glucksmann faction won a crucial internal struggle. Peterson was eased toward the door. Glucksmann consolidated power. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the firm might finally achieve the decisive direction it had lacked. Glucksmann immediately began reshaping Lehman in his image, pushing into merchant banking, into trading, into the newly minted world of junk bonds and leveraged buyouts. The pace quickened. The risk appetite grew. There was something exhilarating about it, and something unsettling too. The old Lehman had been conservative. This new one felt like it was running towards something without being entirely sure what. Yet even as Glucksmann was consolidating his control, history was preparing another shock. In 1984, Lehman faced a moment of genuine crisis. One of its major clients was about to fail, and the exposure threatened the firm's capital. Lehman needed rescue, and that rescue came in an unexpected form. American Express, the credit card and financial services company, agreed to acquire Lehman Brothers. On the surface, it appeared to solve Lehman's immediate problem. American Express had capital, stability, access to vast customer networks. The merger seemed to many like a natural evolution, a premier investment bank being absorbed into a larger financial conglomerate. But for those who understood Lehman's DNA, who felt the weight of the family name and the century of independence that preceded it, the acquisition felt like something else. A death, perhaps, or at least a fundamental transformation. The Lehman name would survive, but the autonomy, the partnership structure, the idea that a group of men could sit in a room and make decisions binding on themselves, all of that was being surrendered. The partners received cash. The firm received a parent company. In the years that followed, American Express executives would struggle with how to manage this acquisition, how to maintain the morale of a proud institution now subordinated to corporate hierarchy. Lehman Brothers, for the first time in its history, was answering to someone else, and that someone else had a very different understanding of risk, of culture, of what a financial firm should be. The irony, if one pauses to consider it, is deeply quiet. The internal struggle that had consumed Lehman in the 1970s and early 1980s was never actually resolved. Glucksmann had won the battle with Peterson, but the victory had come at a cost the firm could not afford. The institutional stability that had allowed Lehman to survive 1929, the Depression, and countless smaller upheavals had been eroded from within. In reaching for a faster, more aggressive future, the partnership had lost something essential: the unity of purpose, the sense that everyone at Lehman was steward of something larger than their own ambitions. What remained was ambition alone, now channeled through the structures of American Express, waiting for new conditions to test whether that would be enough. The years following the American Express departure had left Lehman Brothers in a peculiar state, owned yet somehow unburdened, watched over yet yearning for its own direction. The firm had been a subsidiary, a division within a larger corporate structure, and while that ownership had brought stability and resources, it had also meant something quieter was missing, something that had defined the Lehman name for a century and a half, that spark of independence, that particular hunger that comes only when a house is truly its own. By 1994, the moment arrived. American Express made the decision to spin off Lehman Brothers as an independent entity once more, returning it to the trading floors and to the people who had built it from inside. It was as though a child, raised in a secure household, had come of age and chosen to build its own home. The separation was deliberate, methodical, and when it became official, something shifted in the air of the firm's offices. Doors that had felt borrowed now felt permanent. Decisions that had required distant approvals now belonged entirely to the people making them. And into this moment of liberation stepped a man named Richard Fould, though the trading floors had long since taken to calling him Dick. He was not born to the Lehman legacy, not a descendant of the brothers themselves, not someone whose name appeared in the founding documents or the oil paintings that hung in the firm's mahogany-lined halls. He was, instead, a self-made banker who had climbed the ranks from within, who had earned his position through a combination of ambition, financial acumen, and a particular intensity of focus that made people remember him when he walked into a room. Fuld had joined Lehman in 1966, before the American Express acquisition, and had spent the intervening decades watching, learning, rising through the hierarchy in ways that seemed almost inevitable once you observed his trajectory. He understood the markets. He understood how capital moved. He understood something deeper too, the psychology of traders, the architecture of deals, the way a firm's culture was built not from above, but from within the thousands of small decisions made each day on the trading floor. When he became chief executive of the newly independent Lehman Brothers in 1994, he was 48 years old, seasoned, and possessed of a vision that was both clear and, in its way, almost intoxicating. The firm he inherited was itself in transition. The financial world of 1994 bore only a distant resemblance to the world of 1844, or even 1944. Computers had replaced ledgers, electronic trading had compressed time. Global markets no longer closed at 5 o'clock. They simply moved across time zones in an endless, accelerating flow. The simple business of buying and selling cotton had evolved into something vastly more abstract and intricate, a landscape of securities, derivatives, mortgage-backed bonds, and instruments so complex that their architecture required graduate mathematics to comprehend. Lehman, under Fuld's leadership, began to transform itself with something approaching missionary zeal. The firm would no longer be content to be a respected, steady, quietly successful house. It would be aggressive. It would compete for every deal, every client, every opportunity. It would grow not merely through prudent expansion, but through deliberate risk-taking, through the recruitment of the hungriest talent from across Wall Street, through a culture that rewarded ambition and punished hesitation. The 1990s were buoyant years for finance, years when the internet was rewriting the rules of everything, when it seemed that the old constraints on growth and profit had simply vanished like morning mist. Fuld embodied this new Lehman. He was a presence in the office, visible, demanding, intensely focused on metrics and performance. Unlike some executives who retreated to corner offices, he moved through the firm's corridors and trading floors with a kind of restless energy. Employees learned to recognize when a good quarter had been achieved, not from official announcements, but from the subtle shift in his demeanor. He set targets that seemed to others nearly impossible and then expected them to be met, and remarkably, often they were. The spin-off itself had released capital, had clarified ownership and decision-making, had given Fuld a canvas upon which to paint his vision for what Lehman could become. Where it had been cautious under Robert Lehman, it would now be bold. Where it had been content with its market position, it would now be acquisitive. The firm began to hire. It began to expand its operations in Asia and Europe. It built new divisions, entered new markets, recruited stars from rival firms with compensation packages designed to tempt them. There was in the air a sense of unlimited possibility, a belief that this firm, this ancient, respected house, could be transformed into something more nimble, more profitable, more dominant than ever before. What perhaps no one articulated clearly at the time, though some may have felt it without naming it, was that this transformation represented a kind of break with the past. Not an intentional repudiation of the principles that had sustained Lehman through a century and a half of finance, but a gradual migration away from them. The careful, relationship-based banking of the family era, the cautious rebuilding after 1929, the notion that a firm's reputation was its most precious asset because reputation moved slowly and took generations to build, but but could evaporate in a moment. These values had become, somehow, obstacles rather than anchors. The new Lehman would be different, faster, more aggressive, more willing to take risks that the old Lehman would have examined carefully and then declined. And as the 1990s progressed, as profits rose and the stock market climbed higher each year, as every financial firm seemed to be minting money with an ease that suggested the rules of economics had fundamentally changed, this new orientation seemed not reckless but visionary. Fuld was leading Lehman not backward into its history, but forward into its future. Or so it seemed, as the decade turned and the new millennium approached. The world that Dick Fuld inherited as chief executive in the early 1990s was transforming in ways that earlier Lehmans could scarcely have imagined. The trading floors had grown vertically and horizontally, spreading across entire floors of glass towers in Midtown Manhattan, connected by networks of fiber-optic cables and humming with the constant chatter of telephone headsets. The energy was different now, less the measured deliberation of Robert Lehman's era, more the quickened pulse of a market that had discovered it could move at the speed of electronic signals. Fortunes were being made and lost not in months or years, but in hours. And Lehman Brothers, having survived nearly a century and a half through caution and reputation, now faced a peculiar pressure, the pressure to grow as aggressively as its hungrier competitors, or risk being left behind in a landscape where size and speed had become synonymous with safety. Fuld was, by many accounts, a man shaped by ambition. He had come up through the ranks as a fixed-income trader, which meant he understood the psychology of markets in a visceral way, the rhythms of buying and selling, the moment when fear tips into panic, when greed becomes reckless. He was known for his intensity, his focus, his willingness to make bold bets, and as the 90s began their ascent, the entire financial industry seemed to reward that very temperament. Technology stocks were soaring, investment banking was booming. The barriers between different types of financial services were crumbling as Glass-Steagall regulations, those careful firewalls erected after the crash of 1929, began to erode through a series of legislative changes that would culminate, a few years later, in their formal repeal. It was as though the cautionary walls built by an earlier generation had become inconvenient antiquities. Inside Lehman's offices, a new culture was taking shape. Younger traders and investment bankers arrived with business school degrees and a hunger for wealth that was unambiguous and unapologetic. The old partnership model, where a handful of senior partners bore the risk and reaped the rewards, while more junior staff remained on steady salaries, was giving way to a system where bonus pools were distributed more widely, where the possibility of vast personal wealth dangled before anyone talented enough to capture it. The trading floors became stages for ego and competition. There was a certain intoxicating atmosphere to it, the sense that nothing was impossible if you were smart enough and bold enough, if you were willing to take risks that your competitors would consider reckless. Does a culture of ambition eventually blind an institution to its own vulnerabilities, or is that simply how markets function, always oscillating between excess and contraction? The securitization revolution was beginning to reshape the business of lending and borrowing across the American economy. Banks could originate mortgages and then, within weeks, sell them off to be bundled and transformed into securities, mathematical constructs that promised steady returns and spread risk across thousands of investors worldwide. For a firm like Lehman Brothers, which had always made money through trading and investment, this presented an extraordinary opportunity. The mortgage securities business was expanding, almost exponentially, and the spreads, the profits to be made from buying mortgages and selling them as securities, were substantial. Lehman jumped into the mortgage business with enthusiasm. The real estate markets were heating up, construction was booming. Housing prices, particularly in places like Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and California, seemed to be on an unstoppable trajectory upward. Why would anyone think otherwise? Throughout the 1990s, Lehman's balance sheet expanded dramatically. The firm was acquiring new businesses, expanding into new markets, hiring aggressively. The trading desk that handled mortgages became one of the crown jewels of the operation. Young traders who understood the mathematics of derivatives and securitization, the way mortgages could be sliced into tranches and reassembled into new financial instruments, were treated as superstars, compensated lavishly when their bets paid off. The risk management systems were in place, of course. Every major financial institution had risk managers, quantitative analysts, people whose job it was to model the scenarios in which investments might go wrong. But here lay a subtle problem, one that was nearly impossible to articulate at the time. The models were built on historical data, on past patterns of housing prices and mortgage defaults. And for several decades before the 90s, that data showed housing prices rising, defaults remaining manageable, the mortgage market functioning as a safe and productive engine of American wealth creation. It was tempting to believe that the past was prologue, that the future would resemble the recent past. The culture of the trading floor rewarded those who asked fewer questions about worst-case scenarios and more questions about how to exploit the present opportunity. There was a certain seductive logic to it. If you bet conservatively while your competitors bet boldly, and their bets pay off handsomely while yours merely perform acceptably, you look foolish. You get passed over for promotions. The traders with the largest bonuses are the ones who are willing to take concentrated positions, to make leveraged bets, to push the mathematics of profit-making to its theoretical limits. And Lehman Brothers, a firm that had once been defined by its prudence and its long view, began to be defined instead by its aggressiveness and its hunger for short-term returns. The 1990s were a golden age for Wall Street. The stock market was soaring. The Federal Reserve, under Alan Greenspan, had embraced a philosophy that markets were fundamentally self-correcting, that financial innovation was inherently stabilizing, that regulation should be light, and that the invisible hand of competition would prevent institutions from taking on excessive risk. It was a seductive worldview, particularly if you were making extraordinary amounts of money. Senior executives at Lehman could walk through the lobbies of their buildings and see young people in their 20s and 30s earning $500,000 or more per year. The headquarters itself became a symbol of the firm's prowess. A gleaming tower, a monument to financial success. There was a sense of invulnerability, perhaps even of destiny. Lehman Brothers had survived the Great Depression, the wars, the oil shocks of the 70s, the crash of 1987. It had navigated every crisis of the post-war era and emerged stronger. So perhaps it could navigate this era of abundance as well, could ride the wave of growth without ever succumbing to the gravitational pull that eventually brings all waves back down to shore. The psychology of financial markets is complex and deeply human. Optimism feeds on itself. When an asset class is rising, and housing prices were rising almost everywhere in America during the late 90s and early 2000s, the success of past bets encourages larger bets. Profits that were earned early on become capital for even more ambitious plays. And because the profits are real, because the money is actually flowing into the accounts of traders and executives and shareholders, the entire narrative feels vindicated. The smart people, the ones with the best schools and the sharpest minds, are the ones making these bets. How could they all be wrong? Lehman Brothers, by the late 90s and early 2000s, had become a firm in love with its own trajectory. The ambition that Dick Fuld had embodied when he took the helm had become, in some ways, the firm's defining characteristic. Lehman did not simply want to survive, it wanted to dominate. It wanted to grow faster than Goldman Sachs, to take bigger risks than Morgan Stanley, to be so central to the functioning of American capital markets that the very thought of its failure would be unthinkable. And for a time, for a glorious and intoxicating stretch of years, that ambition seemed justified by results. The towers grew taller, the towers filled with ambitious people, and somewhere, in the background, almost inaudible beneath the roar of trading and the hum of ambition, the first quiet rumblings of a housing market that was beginning to show signs of strain went largely unheeded. To understand what would unravel so dramatically in the years ahead, it helps to step back and trace the quiet machinery of a financial invention that, on the surface, seemed almost elegant in its logic. This invention was called securitization, and it transformed the way money moved through the American housing system. It began with a simple question that bankers had been asking themselves for decades. What happens to a mortgage once you've made it? For most of history, the answer was straightforward. A family would approach a local bank. The bank would evaluate the borrower, make a judgment about their reliability, hold on to that mortgage for the next 30 years, and collect the monthly payments, interest and principal, as a form of steady, predictable income. The bank had what you might call skin in the game. If the borrower defaulted, the bank bore the loss. This created a natural incentive for caution. Bankers asked hard questions. They verified income carefully. They wanted to know their borrowers, or at least know them well enough to trust them. The relationship, in a sense, was intimate. Financial risk was local. It was personal. But by the 1970s, economists and financial engineers began to ask a different question. What if you didn't have to hold on to that mortgage yourself? What if you could take a portfolio of mortgages, hundreds of them, or thousands, bundle them together, and sell them to someone else? You would collect the origination fees and the servicing fees, and then the risk would move to a buyer far away, someone you'd never meet, someone who existed perhaps only on the other side of a financial instrument. This is where securitization enters. Imagine a stream of monthly mortgage payments flowing in from thousands of homeowners across the country. Now imagine packaging that stream into a security, a bond, essentially, that could be bought and sold just like a share of stock. You're essentially dividing up those future payment streams and selling them to investors who have no idea who lives in those houses, who simply see the promise of steady income, and crucially, a rating from a credit agency saying the risk is very low, perhaps AAA, the safest rating available. There's an elegant logic to this, on the surface. Spreading risk across many borrowers and many investors seems safer than concentrating it in one bank. It seems to democratize home ownership because it frees up capital. A bank that has just sold off its mortgages has money to lend again, immediately. It can originate more mortgages. More families can buy homes. What's not to like? And for a while, it worked rather beautifully. The system functioned as intended through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Mortgages were still made primarily to borrowers, with solid credit and the ability to afford them. The process moved slowly. There was still a kind of friction built into it. The originating bank knew it had to maintain a certain standard, because if its loans defaulted too frequently, investors would lose confidence, and the bank's access to the securitization market would dry up. Reputation still mattered. It was a check, a governor on excess. But consider what happens now if that check is removed. What if originators are no longer held accountable for the quality of the mortgages they make? What if a bank can originate a mortgage in January and have it sold off to investors by March, so the risk is no longer theirs, so the long-term consequences are not their responsibility? The incentive structure flips. Suddenly, the goal is not to make good loans. The goal is to make as many loans as possible. The goal is volume. This was the fundamental shift that would reshape American finance in the early years of the 21st century. Though few inside Lehman Brothers, or anywhere on Wall Street, dwelt on it with much concern at the time. The machinery of securitization became faster, more complex, more abstracted from the actual homes and actual humans underlying it. And here is where a second layer of complexity enters, quietly, like dust settling. Banks began to securitize not just traditional mortgages, but increasingly exotic ones. Subprime mortgages, mortgages made to borrowers with poor credit or no credit history. Interest-only mortgages, where borrowers paid only interest for the first few years before the principal payments ballooned upward. Adjustable rate mortgages, where the interest rate was low initially, but then reset higher after a few years, making payments swell suddenly. How could such risky loans be packaged and sold as safe investments? Here is where a third layer of engineering enters. The securities were divided into tiers, or tranches, a word that comes from the French meaning to slice. The safest slice, the senior tranche, would be paid first from incoming mortgage payments. Only after the senior tranche was fully paid would the junior tranches receive anything. This meant that junior investors bore more risk, but senior investors were supposedly very safe. They would only suffer losses if defaulters were so numerous and so widespread that the entire system failed. Surely that couldn't happen. Housing prices never fell nationally, not since the Great Depression. Surely the senior tranches were actually safe. And so mortgages flowed into the securitization machine, thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands. Bankers stopped asking who the borrower was. They stopped verifying incomes with the care they once had. Some mortgages were made to borrowers who were not asked to prove they had any income at all. These were called ninja loans. No income, no job or assets. And they were a kind of financial fiction dressed up as a debt obligation. Lehman Brothers, as an investment bank and a major mortgage trader, was deeply involved in this machinery. The firm bought mortgages from originators, bundled them into securities, and sold them to investors around the world. It also began to create increasingly complex securities, securities backed by other securities, derivative upon derivative, structures so nested with abstractions that even the people inside the firm could struggle to explain how they worked or how much risk they actually contained. But again, none of this felt dangerous at the time. The system seemed to be working. Housing prices kept rising. Investors kept buying. Lehman's mortgage division became one of the most profitable in the firm. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. The link between the original lender and the ultimate investor had been severed. The person who received the mortgage payment bore no responsibility for the person who made it. Trust, that ancient currency of banking, had been replaced by abstraction and mathematics. And mathematics, as any sleeper knows in the deepest hours, can feel certain until the moment it fails. The early years of the 21st century arrived in America with a peculiar sense of inevitability, as though the nation had discovered a secret the world had somehow missed, that housing, that most fundamental human shelter, could serve as both home and vault, both necessity and investment vehicle all at once. And in those first few years after the millennium turned, when the trauma of the dot-com crash had begun to fade, and the broader markets seemed hungry once again for yield, for return, for the promise of something that would grow without end, the real estate market began to accelerate with a momentum that few paused to question deeply. Picture, if you will, a quiet transformation taking place not in gleaming skyscrapers, but in the everyday architecture of American neighborhoods. A house in suburban Florida that might have sold for $200,000 in 1998 was suddenly worth $350,000 in 2004. A modest ranch in Las Vegas that sat on desert land no more special than any other parcel was suddenly climbing in value month by month, as though invisible hands were gently lifting its worth skyward. These were not abstract financial instruments. These were places where families slept, where children played in yards, where decades of accumulated dreams lived inside the walls. Yet something had shifted in the machinery of how these homes were being sold and financed. The traditional model, the one that had held steady for generations, a borrower walks into a bank, proves their income, provides a down payment, receives a 30-year mortgage. That model was beginning to crack open into something far more permeable, far more experimental. Banks, it seemed, had grown comfortable with a kind of mathematical abstraction. If a home was worth $200,000, surely someone could borrow $190,000 of it. And if housing prices were rising reliably, predictably, then surely a borrower who couldn't quite afford the payments today would be able to refinance, to cash out, to move up to a larger house tomorrow. The term subprime entered the conversation, not with alarms but almost gently, as though it were a technical classification rather than a warning. These were mortgages extended to borrowers with blemished credit histories, with lower incomes, with less capacity to absorb a missed payment or an unexpected expense. In another era, a lending officer would have turned such applications away, but in the early 2000s, when demand for mortgages seemed infinite, and when the infrastructure of Wall Street was hungry for them, when investment banks were eager to purchase them, bundle them, slice them into securities, and sell them onward, the criteria softened. What had once been a filter became more of a suggestion. Lehman Brothers, by this time, had evolved into something quite different from the careful, reputation-conscious firm that had weathered the Depression. It was now a sprawling, competitive, aggressive organization, filled with traders and bankers who had grown up in an era where risk-taking was rewarded and caution was punished as timidity. There was something almost intoxicating about the scale of the mortgage market, about the apparent simplicity of it. Buy mortgages, bundle them, sell them, take a small fee on each transaction, and let someone else hold the risk. This was the new alchemy, and it seemed to work flawlessly. From 2003 onward, Lehman's real estate and mortgage exposure began to climb, first modestly, and then with accelerating fervor. The firm invested in mortgage companies. It originated mortgages itself. It accumulated vast portfolios of mortgage-backed securities. And crucially, it held much of this inventory on its own balance sheet, on the assumption that housing prices would continue their upward march, that liquidity would always be available, that the underlying assets would retain their value. It was a form of leverage stacked upon leverage. The firm was using borrowed money to amplify its bets on an asset class that was itself being created through borrowed money, a pyramid of debt resting on a foundation that was itself debt. What did Lehman's leadership see in this? Primarily, they saw growth. They saw market share. They saw competitors like Bear Stearns and Morgan Stanley and others capturing what appeared to be risk-free profits, and Lehman could not afford to be left behind. There was a kind of inevitability to it, a sense that this was simply where the business had gone, where the returns were, where a firm needed to position itself to remain relevant. The mortgage market was growing at 30, 40, sometimes 50% annually. The fees were substantial. The apparent safety, because housing had never really crashed, not on a national scale, not in the collective memory of anyone currently working in finance, felt almost guaranteed. And yet, beneath these rosy projections, certain observant souls were beginning to notice peculiarities, small cracks in the facade. They noticed that stated income loans were increasingly common, mortgages where borrowers simply declared their income without documentation, where the verification step had been removed for the sake of speed and volume. They noticed that adjustable-rate mortgages, loans where the interest rate started low and then reset higher after a few years, were being extended to borrowers who couldn't possibly afford the payments once that reset occurred. It was as though the loan itself was designed on the assumption that refinancing would occur before the mathematics became catastrophic. Some of this was deliberate marketing. Some of it was simply the natural outcome of a system where the originator of the mortgage never held the risk. They sold it immediately to an investment bank, which then passed it along to other investors. No one in this chain bore the consequences if the borrower ultimately couldn't pay. The incentive was purely to create volume, to generate transactions, to keep the pipeline flowing. And so it did flow, month after month, year after year, faster and faster. By 2005 and 2006, the peak years of the boom, something almost dreamlike had taken hold. Homes that hadn't sold in years suddenly had multiple offers. Bidding wars erupted over properties that were barely differentiated from one another. In certain markets, speculators were buying houses not to live in them, but simply to flip them, to hold them for a few months and sell them at a profit to the next speculator. The line between investment and home ownership had blurred almost beyond recognition. And Lehman Brothers, with its thousands of employees, its prestigious name, its century-long history of surviving crises, was holding more and more of this debt on its balance sheet. The firm had created a real estate division that was growing rapidly. It had hired specialists in securitization, in underwriting, in the origination process itself. There was a sense of excitement, of being at the center of something momentous, of capturing the future of finance. Few seemed to pause and ask whether this particular future might be fragile, whether it rested on assumptions that might not hold, or if they did ask such questions, those voices were drowned out by the roar of profitable expansion. The mathematics seemed so clear at the time. Housing prices had always gone up. People needed shelter. The demographic trends suggested more households, more demand. The Fed kept interest rates low. Credit was abundant. And every day, every single day, mortgages were being created and purchased and packaged and sold. And Lehman was in the middle of it, taking its cut, building its position, betting with increasing confidence that this road would continue forward indefinitely, that the landscape would never change, that what had begun as a means of financing shelter had somehow transcended the ordinary laws of economics and would continue its ascent forever. In the spring of 2007, the first small fractures began to appear in the structure that Lehman Brothers had spent more than 160 years building, though few inside the firm seemed to notice, or if they did, they chose a different interpretation of what those cracks might mean. Outside the tower on 7th Avenue, in the broader American landscape, there were whispers growing louder. Housing prices, which had climbed with almost religious certainty for so long that many people had begun to assume the ascent was written into the laws of nature itself, began hesitating. In some markets they paused, in others they reversed. And among the subprime borrowers, those millions of Americans with shakier credit and smaller down payments, people who had been sold mortgages bundled as investment products, the first waves of defaults began to ripple outward. Default, such a clinical word for such human distress. Families unable to pay, homes slipping away, dreams deferred. The mechanisms that had seemed so brilliantly engineered, so mathematically sound, so far removed from the messy reality of a borrower unable to make a payment. Those mechanisms began to grind. The mortgage-backed securities, those elaborate structures that had transferred risk through so many hands that no single institution could easily say where the danger now lived. These securities began to lose their assumed value, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Lehman Brothers by this time held something on the order of $100 billion in assets related to real estate. 100 billion. That figure, repeated slowly, might sink in. $100 billion. The firm had grown so vast, so confident in its ability to navigate markets and manage risk, that this exposure felt not reckless but reasonable, necessary, the price of being a player in the most lucrative game on Wall Street. But numbers on a ledger and numbers in the world are not always the same thing, are they? What looked reasonable in a spreadsheet when housing prices were rising began to look different when prices began to fall. Through the spring and into the summer of 2007, alarm bells sounded in certain corners of the financial world. Bear Stearns, the investment bank that had itself survived the Great Depression and the crashes that followed, was in distress. Its hedge funds that had invested heavily in mortgage securities were collapsing. By August, the central banks of the developed world were injecting liquidity into the system, trying to prevent a complete freezing of credit. The machinery of finance was showing signs of jamming. And yet inside Lehman, the culture that had grown up through the Dick-fooled years was one of aggressive confidence bordering on what some observers, being generous, might call optimism. The firm had survived previous crisis. It had adapted. It had grown. Lehman had weathered the long-term capital management collapse of 1998. It had navigated the dot-com implosion. The leadership, many of whom had risen through decades of bull markets and expansions, may have genuinely believed, or at least convinced themselves, that the firm's size, sophistication, and talent made it uniquely resilient. There is a peculiar psychology that develops in long, successful institutions, a kind of institutional pride that can tip into blindness without anyone quite noticing the moment of tilt. The warnings were there, though. In the mortgage market itself, signals were flashing red. The delinquency rates on subprime loans were rising sharply. Foreclosures were accelerating. Major lenders were pulling back, retreating from the market that had seemed so profitable just months before. It was like watching a forest floor become unstable in slow motion, the earth appearing solid until suddenly it isn't. But Lehman, which had made enormous bets on the continuation of the housing boom and the stability of mortgage securities, was slow to acknowledge what the numbers were actually saying. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that different parts of the firm were saying different things to themselves. The traders on the floor were watching. They could feel the market shifting, but the executives who managed the portfolios, who held so much of the firm's capital in illiquid real estate positions, seemed caught between two contradictory needs: the need to believe that the position was sound, that the exposure was manageable, and the need to act decisively if it wasn't. It is a painful place to be, suspended between competing truths. Many people in the firm probably thought something like this: we have too much riding on housing to admit that housing is in trouble. We have bet too heavily. If we admit the danger, we must act. And if we act, we confirm the danger. So there exists a temptation, very human and very organizational, to delay acknowledgement just a little bit longer. By late 2007, Lehman's third quarter showed signs of strain. The firm was moving some of its riskier real estate assets into a special investment vehicle, a way of moving them off the balance sheet temporarily, a technique used in accounting that some later observers would view with deep skepticism. The public face remained steady. The executives spoke of confidence in the firm's positions. They acknowledged that the housing market was cooling, of course, but they suggested the damage would be contained. Subprime was a small part of the overall mortgage market, they said. The broader financial system was stable. There would be a slowdown, certainly, but not a collapse. What no one could quite say, or perhaps what everyone was afraid to say all at once, was, what if we were wrong about all of it? What if the models that had guided decisions were based on assumptions that no longer held? What if houses were not a guaranteed store of value? What if the American housing market could actually go down, and down precipitously, and that $100 billion in exposure, when prices are falling, might not be a position you can simply manage through? These questions, sensible and clarifying as they seem now, were difficult ones to voice inside a firm that had built its modern identity on risk appetite and conquest. The second half of 2007 unfolded in a strange kind of suspension. The firm continued its operations. Bonuses were being calculated for the year. Lehman was still hiring in some divisions, still confident in its future, and yet the underlying terrain was shifting. The housing market had begun its descent. The securities derived from mortgages were becoming harder to sell. The credit markets were beginning a process of repricing that would ultimately expose just how many institutions, not only Lehman, but across the entire ecosystem of finance, had made similar bets, had believed similar stories, had taken for granted that a boom that had lasted so long would simply continue. There is something almost meditative in the slowness of it, the way that crises often do not announce themselves with a bang, but rather unfold over weeks and months, with each day seeming almost normal until you look back and realize that the normal you were living in was something else entirely. The fall of a great institution is not usually the work of a single moment, but rather the accumulated weight of many small errors, many assumptions that went unquestioned, many instances in which the desire to believe triumphed over the evidence in front of one's eyes. The week of September 8th, 2008, began like any other Monday morning on Wall Street, except it did not. The markets had closed on Friday with the weight of knowing something terrible was coming, though nobody could quite name it. Lehman Brothers had survived August with its dignity, or so it seemed. The American government had stepped in to rescue Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac over that weekend, the mortgage giants that had grown too tangled in the fabric of national finance to fail. But Lehman, Richard Fuld insisted to his inner circle, was different. Lehman was stronger. Lehman had more time. The trading floors hummed with a particular kind of electricity that morning, the kind that precedes catastrophe. Telephones rang in overlapping rhythms. Money moved in and out of accounts with increasing speed. By the afternoon, the credit markets had begun to close like a fist. Banks that might have lent to Lehman on Friday would not answer calls on Monday. The confidence that had sustained the firm for 164 years was evaporating, visible in real time like morning dew, and there was nothing anyone could do to hold it back. In the executive suites on the upper floors, a different conversation was unfolding. Lehman Brothers needed capital, and it needed it immediately. The firm's balance sheet, which had seemed solid weeks before, now appeared to investors as a thing made of shadow and hope. The mortgages they held, bundled and rebundled, were worth far less than anyone had written on the books. The leverage that had seemed so profitable in 2006 now looked like a rope tied around the firm's own throat. Dick Fuld, the chief executive who had steered Lehman from one crisis to another, from the savings and loan collapse to the Asian contagion to the dot-com bubble, now faced something different. He was not a man accustomed to being told no. He was not accustomed to the idea that his will, his presence, his force of personality could not bend circumstances to his advantage. And yet that is what was happening. Phone calls that went out at noon were not returned by evening. Conversations that had seemed promising evaporated within hours. The government, which had suddenly become so active in matters of finance, was sending a message. Lehman would have to find a buyer. The Federal Reserve had arranged things with Bear Stearns in March. JP Morgan had swallowed that firm with government assistance. The assumption, the hope at least, was that something similar might happen again, but the banking system itself was now too frightened. No major bank wanted to touch Lehman. The liabilities were too large, the quality of the assets too questionable. Which is to say that trust, the very thing upon which banking rests and always has rested, was simply no longer there. Barclays Capital, the British banking arm of Barclays plc, appeared to show some interest. Meetings were held, numbers were exchanged. There were moments, brief and fragile, when it seemed as though a deal might be possible. Fuld and his team worked through the nights, imagining scenarios, tracing the intricate paths by which Lehman might be subdivided and sold off. But the regulators demanded that Barclays shareholders approve the deal, and the shareholders, thousands of miles away, looking at what Lehman was actually holding, demurred. By Tuesday, the idea had faded. Bank of America, which had seemed a possibility, decided instead on Merrill Lynch. That acquisition was announced on Sunday, September 14th, to the shock of nearly everyone, because it suggested that even the second largest investment bank in America had concluded its time was ending. If Merrill Lynch, which had roots in American finance stretching back to the 1920s, needed to be absorbed to survive, then what hope was there for Lehman? The question that haunted the executives of Lehman Brothers in that final week was not a new one. It was a question that had haunted their ancestors, the merchants of Alabama and the traders of the Gilded Age and the underwriters of the 20th century. When does the world lose faith? When does the invisible thing that makes money valuable and trust possible begin to evaporate? And once it starts to go, can anything be done to retrieve it? By Wednesday night, the mood in the offices had shifted from desperate hope to something quieter and more terrible. Acceptance, perhaps. The realization that no buyer would come, that the government had decided Lehman was large but not too large to fail, that the math had been done and the decision made, though nobody had actually said it aloud. Thursday morning, a meeting in the offices of the Federal Reserve in Manhattan. Fuld was there with his team. The regulators were there. The heads of other major banks were there. They went around the room, each one saying no. JP Morgan said no. Wells Fargo said no. Goldman Sachs said no. Morgan Stanley said no. It was a ritual, a formal acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. There was no white knight. There would be no rescue. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in the United States, which had made it through the Civil War and the Great Panic of 1929 and the Depression and 50 years of post-war growth, which had financed the airlines that carried Americans across the continent and the retailers that had shaped their dreams, which had employed hundreds of thousands of people over its long life and given its name to prosperity and ambition on Wall Street, would not exist by the end of the weekend. The actual bankruptcy filing happened on Monday, September 15th. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history, larger than General Motors would be a few months later, larger than any corporate failure the country had yet witnessed. The documents were filed in the early morning hours, in New York federal court. The words on the page were dry and technical, full of the vocabulary of insolvency and liquidation and claims. But what they meant, stripped of the language, was that the firm was dead. No amount of restructuring would change that. The pattern was broken. The long thread of continuity that had stretched from Montgomery, Alabama in 1844 all the way to Lower Manhattan in 2008 had finally snapped. The employees learned the news from news reports, many of them. They had not been told beforehand, not really. There had been hours of silence, of waiting, of the particular agony that comes from knowing something terrible is about to happen and being powerless to stop it. Then the announcement came, and the silence broke into 1,000 different sounds, phones being packed, files being boxed, people walking through the hallways in states that ranged from shock to grief to a strange kind of relief that the waiting was finally over. What is it that happens to a place when the people who worked there know it will not exist tomorrow? The offices of Lehman Brothers, which had hummed with the confidence of certainty for so long, became something else. They became a place of endings, a place where careers were being terminated and fortunes were being dissolved, and the future was being recalculated in the minds of thousands of people at once. The traders and the analysts and the administrative assistants and the security guards, all of them tried to process what it meant, and most of them could not. A name that had meant stability, opportunity, success, access to the great world of finance, a name that parents had spoken proudly when their children asked what they did for work. That name would no longer be on business cards or office letterheads or the sides of buildings. The moment itself, the instant of bankruptcy, left no visible mark. The markets continued to fall, but they had been falling for days. The phones continued to ring, but they rang with different conversations now. The ledgers and the accounts and the transactions continued on, but they meant something entirely different. A firm that had survived by adapting and enduring and maintaining the trust of others had finally encountered something it could not adapt to, the absolute loss of trust itself. happening so quickly and so completely that there was no recovery from it, no negotiation, no second act. On Monday, September 15th, 2008, in the pre-dawn hours before the news anchors would begin their solemn recitations, a man named Thomas stepped out of the elevator on the 23rd floor of 745 7th Avenue, Lehman's Manhattan headquarters, and found himself standing in the quiet aftermath of something he could not yet fully name. The markets had not yet opened. The phones had not yet begun their relentless ringing. There was only the soft hum of machines that would soon be powered down, the ghostly glow of screens still logged into accounts that no longer belonged to anyone. He stood for a moment in the pale light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city below slowly wake, and something in the suspension of that moment, the last breath before the drowning, felt almost peaceful. By the time the sun had properly risen, the phones began, then the emails, then the announcements from floors above and below, voices crackling through the intercom system in the controlled tones of people trained to deliver bad news without revealing their own terror. And slowly, as the morning unfolded in real time across television screens and trading floors from London to Hong Kong, the human machinery of Lehman Brothers began to disassemble itself with the kind of quiet inevitability that only makes sense in hindsight. The image that would come to symbolize this disassembly, the photograph that newspapers around the world would print and reprint and project onto evening newscasts, was almost mundane in its specificity. People walking out of the building carrying cardboard boxes, brown bankers' boxes sealed with packing tape, clear plastic storage bins. Some carried framed photographs pulled from their desks. Others held towers of stacked documents or monitors clutched awkwardly to their chests. There was a kind of slow-motion parade of people streaming down 7th Avenue, moving in both directions at once, some standing on the sidewalk frozen in shock, others already hurrying toward the subway as though they could leave this particular moment behind if they moved quickly enough. Can you imagine the weight of it? Not the physical weight of the boxes, though that was real enough, but the weight of understanding, in real time, that an entire context had simply ceased to exist, that your security clearance would expire, that your business cards would become artifacts of a vanished world, that the institution to which you had given years of your life, your focus, your intellectual energy, your lunch hours, had been simultaneously dismantled and preserved in amber, frozen forever in a particular moment of failure. The employees who emerged that day numbered in the thousands. Nearly 15,000 people worked for Lehman Brothers at its peak, distributed across the United States and in offices around the world, in Tokyo, in London, in Frankfurt, in Hong Kong, in Sydney, in Sao Paulo. And on that particular Monday morning, they all learned simultaneously that they were unemployed. No severance packages had been negotiated. No transition plans existed. The company that had survived wars and panics and market collapses by adapting and pivoting and reinventing itself had finally encountered something it could not adapt to, the recognition that it had become toxic to the system itself, that its continued existence was somehow preventing the system's continued function. And so the most merciful thing was dissolution. The stories that emerged in the weeks and months that followed carried a particular texture of loss. There was the investment banker who had been working on a deal when the announcement came, and who found the deal had died along with the firm, not killed by his incompetence, but by proximity to contagion. There was the administrative assistant who had worked there for 27 years, who had seen the office through multiple relocations and reorganizations, who kept a photograph of her first day on her desk and now carried it out in her hands, not sure what else to take with her. There was the young analyst who had been offered a job for the following Monday, contingent on the firm's stability, who realized his entire entry into finance had been premised on an institution that no longer existed. There were the custodial staff who came in that night and found the building half emptied already. Desks still warm, coffee still steaming in ceramic cups, the physical record of a sudden absence. What made the global shockwave so profound was not the American aspect of it, though that was significant. American firms had failed before, but Lehman Brothers was woven through the international financial system in ways that nobody had fully mapped. They were a creditor to banks. They were a counterparty to thousands of contracts. They held trillions of dollars in assets, and when the firm entered bankruptcy, those assets suddenly had no clear ownership, no clear valuation, no clear future. The bankruptcy filing, the largest in American history at that moment, sent tremors through institutions that seemed entirely remote from an American investment bank. In Germany, banks discovered they held Lehman paper that was now worthless. In the UK, local pension funds found their investments tangled up in the debris. In Australia, there was a run on money market funds as institutions worldwide suddenly lost confidence in the stability of what they had thought were safe parking places for capital. The unraveling happened not in a single cataclysmic moment, but in a series of small collapses, each one a domino that brushed against the next domino, which brushed against the next. Interbank lending froze because no one knew which banks held the most toxic Lehman-related assets. Credit markets seized. Insurance companies that had written credit default swaps on Lehman debt suddenly faced massive claims, and those claims had to be paid out of their reserves, which threatened their solvency, which threatened institutions that had bought their insurance. A kind of paranoia spread through the system, rational at each moment but collectively catastrophic. If Lehman, with all its history and sophistication, could collapse so suddenly, then which other institution might be hiding similar wounds? What the world was witnessing, though few could articulate it clearly in those early hours, was not the failure of one firm, but the failure of a certain set of assumptions about how risk could be distributed and managed. The people carrying their boxes out of 745 7th Avenue were walking away from a model of finance that had held for decades. The belief that complexity could be engineered safely, that sophistication could substitute for caution, that size itself was a form of insurance against catastrophe. They were moving through an invisible threshold between one era of finance and another. The boxes they carried somehow lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because they held merely personal belongings, heavier because each item represented a world that would not return exactly as it had been. The global impact began to crystallize very quickly. Emerging market currencies fell sharply as foreign investors rushed to extract capital from what suddenly seemed risky. Credit markets that had been churning out trillions in liquidity dried up in a matter of hours. Central banks in multiple countries began emergency interventions, rushing to provide liquidity where market mechanisms had failed. The G7 finance ministers held emergency conference calls. There was a quality to the panic that was almost elegant in its symmetry. The same financial engineering that had been celebrated for its sophistication now became the source of universal dread, precisely because nobody could trace all the threads, because risk had been bundled and resold and repackaged so many times that it became invisible and omnipresent simultaneously. In the weeks that followed, there would be other images to supplement the box-carrying photograph. There was a screenshot of the Lehman Brothers website, still live and official-looking in its design, but with a banner at the top, Chapter 11 Bankruptcy Filing. There were the quarterly reports that were published as if the firm still existed, dissecting in mathematical precision the various tranches of assets and claims and counterclaims that had calcified into a kind of financial archaeology. There were the reunions of Lehman employees online, threads on internet forums where people who had worked together just days before now compared notes on the strange experience of having your entire professional context removed in an instant. What would eventually matter, though? What would filter down through the system and persist even as the immediate panic subsided was something quieter and more pervasive. The collapse of Lehman did not merely represent the failure of one institution to manage its balance sheet. It represented the moment when the entire infrastructure of trust that had allowed the modern financial system to function began to fracture. Banks stopped lending to each other because they couldn't be certain of the health of their counterparties. Companies struggled to get short-term financing for their operations because the commercial paper markets had seized. Ordinary citizens, watching the news and seeing the boxes being carried out and hearing the numbers, 161 billion in assets, 613 billion in liabilities, began to wonder if their own savings in their own banks were truly safe. And this question, once asked, could not be unasked. It spread like smoke through the consciousness of the global economy, not because banks had actually become less safe in the days after Lehman's collapse, but because a single point of failure had been revealed where people had believed there was none. In the months that followed, the world would learn the names of traders and executives and risk managers who had been at Lehman when the end came. Some of them gave interviews in which they described the sensation of watching the firm liquidate, of seeing their own professional judgment called into question by events they felt were beyond their individual control. Others retreated from public view, carrying their version of the boxes, the interior boxes of guilt, of what-ifs, of the gap between intention and outcome. The bankruptcy itself would take years to unwind. The lawyers and accountants and financial advisors hired to untangle Lehman's estate would earn billions in fees, while creditors waited for their claims to be processed and prioritized and adjudicated. A process that would stretch across a decade and eventually recover something like 70 cents on the dollar for many claimants. Though even this seemingly reasonable outcome would mask vast disparities in who lost what and why. What happened to Lehman in those September days was a public disassembly of the kind we rarely witness in the modern world. Institutions usually fail quietly, or they are merged into something larger, or they are rescued in the grey hours of the morning by consortiums of central banks and finance ministers eager to avoid contagion. But Lehman was allowed to fail in public, and this public failure became a kind of mirror in which the entire financial system was forced to contemplate itself. And what it saw, what we all saw, was not reassuring. In the years that followed, the Lehman building itself became a monument to absence. The trading floors that had hummed with 10,000 voices fell silent. The desks where generations of men and women had watched the tickers roll past their eyes were dismantled, sold off, repurposed. Some found their way into smaller brokerage houses. Others became furniture in anonymous offices where no one remembered their history. The leather chairs, the brass lamps, the small photographs tucked into the corners of monitors, all of it scattered into the vast architecture of forgetting that constitutes the aftermath of collapse. And yet something remarkable happened in the quietness that followed. People began to remember, not the abstractions of derivative instruments, or the mathematical beauty of mortgage-backed securities, but the faces. The woman who had worked in the back office for 32 years, whose son she had helped get into university. The young analyst who had taken a junior position just 3 weeks before the bankruptcy filing, who watched his career dissolve before it had truly begun. The security guards who knew everyone's name, who had checked identification at the lobby desk through boom and bust alike, and who suddenly found themselves checking no one. Lehman Brothers had operated for 164 years. That is a long arc of time, long enough to weather wars and panics and the entire reshaping of the American economic landscape, long enough that people had come to imagine it would simply continue. The way we imagine the buildings we walk past each day will always be there to frame our journeys. But impermanence is perhaps the deepest lesson that institutions teach us, if we listen carefully enough. Not through their collapse, necessarily, but through the very fact of their existence at all, their dependence on human judgment, human trust, human belief that tomorrow will resemble today. What strikes the observer now, looking back across the decades, is how much of Lehman's long survival rested not on mathematical models or computerized risk management, but on something far more fragile and human. The reputation that Henry Lehman had built in Montgomery, Alabama, buying and selling cotton in the 1850s, the trust that his sons had cultivated by dealing honestly through Reconstruction and war, the quiet agreements made between men in offices lit by gaslight, sealed not by electronic signatures, but by handshakes and the unspoken understanding that your word was your currency. For over a century, Lehman succeeded largely because people believed it would succeed. Their belief made it solid. And then, in the early years of the 21st century, something shifted in that calculus. The firm became larger than any single person could truly understand. The instruments it traded became so complex that even the traders themselves could only approximate their meaning. The belief that had once been anchored in reputation became untethered, floating upward into abstractions. Risk became a number on a screen rather than a judgment about the future. And somewhere in that transition, the old covenant, the fundamental assumption that a bank's survival depended on prudence and the trust of its depositors, began to erode. Was Lehman Brothers unique in this regard? Not particularly. Many institutions failed or nearly failed for similar reasons in that turbulent year. But there was something poignant about Lehman's particular story, about the fact that it was not brought down by fraud or criminality, at least not of the deliberate sort. It was brought down by excess, by the gradual erosion of caution, by a culture that had come to believe that the tools of modern finance had somehow transcended the old rules about risk and prudence and the long view. It was brought down, in some fundamental sense, by forgetting its own history. Consider what Lehman had survived: the Civil War, the Panic of 1893, the crash of 1929, and the depths of the Great Depression. The firm had been disciplined by those events. It had learned restraint. Robert Lehman, who led the firm through and beyond the 1929 crash, carried in his person and his practices the memory of what could happen when institutions became overextended. He had seen the bodies floating past the windows, so to speak. He had felt the weight of that moment, and that feeling, that memory, made him cautious. By the year 2008, there were few people left at Lehman who carried that living memory of catastrophe. History had become something to read about in the archives, rather than something felt in the bones. And perhaps that is an inevitable rhythm in institutions and in the minds of the people who lead them. Each generation must learn its own lessons about risk. Each generation must, in some sense, discover anew why caution matters. The irony, though, and here we might pause to consider it, is that Lehman's collapse did more to teach people about the fragility of financial systems than perhaps a century of cautious stewardship ever could. Millions of people who had never given a moment's thought to mortgage securitization or credit default swaps or leveraged positions suddenly had to understand these things. They had to live with the consequences. The abstraction became concrete. The numbers on the screen became human stories of savings lost, of homes foreclosed, of retirements evaporated. In the decade and more that has followed, regulations have been written and rewritten. Risk management systems have been rebuilt. There are now circuit breakers in the markets, automatic pauses when volatility spikes too quickly, designed to prevent the kind of cascading panic that Lehman Brothers embodied. These are not perfect safeguards. No system created by humans can be perfect, but they represent an effort to institutionalize caution, to build into the mechanics of finance itself a memory of what can happen when institutions forget to be afraid. And what of Lehman itself? The name persists in various forms. The bankruptcy proceedings continue, even now, with billions of dollars still being sorted through, redistributed, settled. The buildings that housed Lehman's operations have been occupied by other firms. The leather chairs are worn smooth by the friction of other hands. But the particular institution that Henry Lehman founded, that his descendants built and expanded, that survived a century and a half of historical turbulence, that is gone. It exists now only in memory, in the archives of history, in the stories that people who worked there still tell. There is a strange dignity in that, perhaps, to be remembered not for greatness unqualified, but for a long arc of effort, of presence, of trying to navigate the impossible demands of the financial world with some measure of restraint. Lehman was not the most innovative bank. It was not the largest, not at the end. It was simply there, steady and visible, for a very long time, and then it was not. For those who study institutions and power and the nature of how societies organize themselves around money, the fall of Lehman Brothers remains instructive, not because it was unusual, but because it was so thoroughly ordinary. It teaches us that any system, no matter how large, no matter how long it has endured, rests ultimately on something intangible, on trust, on the belief that the people managing it understand what they are doing, that they care about the long term, that they remember why restraint matters. When that belief erodes, institutions fall. Not dramatically necessarily, not all at once, but quietly, almost inevitably, like a tree that has been growing for centuries in the forest finally finding its time to fall. And in the quiet that follows such a fall, we are left with the opportunity to reflect, to ask ourselves what it is we build, and why, and what we need to remember about the fragility and the preciousness of the structures we create to organize our collective lives. That reflection is perhaps the truest inheritance that Lehman Brothers left behind. Not the lessons written in regulation and textbooks, though those matter too, but the simple human understanding that what we build is temporary, that we must tend to it carefully, and that the moment we stop doing so, the moment we stop believing that our words have meaning and our promises matter, is the moment we begin, however slowly, to lose it all.